There is a hotel room in Manhattan on the 5th floor of a building called the Herald Square Hotel, on the corner of Broadway and 34th Street, and in that room, for more than 2 decades, an old woman lived quietly behind a locked door. She did not come out. She did not let anyone in, except, on rare occasions, a chambermaid who left food in the hall. The shades stayed drawn, the newspapers piled up, the dust settled on the furniture in slow, patient layers, the way dust settles in any room where time has been allowed to forget itself. Inside that room, in cracker tins and shoeboxes and the deep folds of a steamer trunk, was nearly $1 million in cash. The woman who lived there called herself Ida Mayfield Wood. She was, by the time the door finally opened, in her early 90s, and the world she had grown up in had passed away, and the world she had married into had passed away, and even the city she had once moved through with such careful elegance had become, while she was not looking, something almost entirely different from what she remembered. Tonight, slowly and gently, we are going to sit with her story, and let it unfold the way old stories do, like a quilt being unfolded across a bed in a dim and quiet room. There is no rush. There is nowhere we have to be. We will move at the pace of the story itself, which is the pace of a long quiet life, the pace of dust settling on furniture, the pace of an old woman in a chair watching the slow turn of light across a carpet. If you enjoy listening to sleep stories like this, subscribe. I post stories like this weekly. To find Ida, we must first find the city she chose, the city she pressed herself into the way a letter is pressed into wax. New York at the end of the 19th century was a place of extraordinary contrasts, and the contrasts were the point. They were the engine that drove the whole place forward. Imagine standing on Fifth Avenue on a cool October evening in 1880. The lamps are being lit one by a man with a long pole. He moves slowly down the block, and behind him, the soft yellow glow of the gaslights blooms against the deepening blue of the sky. The light is not bright, it is gentle. It pools at the base of each lamppost and fades into the shadows between, and the effect is of walking through a long room lit by candles, even though you are outdoors, even though there are buildings 4 and 5 stories tall on either side of you, even though the city is one of the largest in the world. The buildings here are made of stone, brown stone mostly, but on the grandest blocks the stone gives way to marble, to granite, to limestone imported from quarries in France and Italy. The houses sit shoulder to shoulder along the avenue, each one slightly different from the next, each one announcing in its own quiet language that the family inside has arrived. The windows are tall, the doors are heavy. The brass on the door fittings is polished every morning by a man whose entire job it is to polish brass. Behind those doors the parlours are warm, the fires are lit, the lamps inside have been turned up just enough to read by, and the rooms smell of beeswax and wood smoke and the faint sweet trace of orange peel left in a bowl on a sideboard. There are roses in vases. The roses come from greenhouses in New Jersey, brought in by carriage every other day, and they fill the rooms with a soft, persistent fragrance that mixes with the smell of leather bindings on the books and the polish on the floor. This is the world of old money, this is the world Ida wanted. But to reach this world, you had to come from somewhere, and the somewhere mattered very much. The families who lived in these houses had lived in similar houses for generations. Their names were Schermerhorn and Livingston, and Van Rensselaer and Stuyvesant. Their grandfathers had owned land in Manhattan when Manhattan was still mostly farmland and forest. Their grandmothers had served tea to George Washington. They knew each other. They had always known each other. They could trace their connections to one another the way other people traced rivers on a map, and they could spot a stranger the moment a stranger entered the room. The stranger was not always turned away. Sometimes the stranger had something to offer. A new fortune from railroads or shipping or steel could buy a house on the avenue, and the house could host parties, and the parties could be attended by the right people if the right people were curious enough to come. But there was a difference between being received and being accepted. A new fortune could buy admission. It could not buy belonging. Belonging was a thing handed down across generations, like a christening gown or a silver tea service. It was not for sale. Below the avenue, the city stretched out in every direction, and the further you walked from the brownstones, the more the city changed. A few blocks east, the houses became smaller. The marble disappeared. The brass on the doors gave way to plain iron. The streets narrowed. The smell of coal smoke grew thicker, and the smell of horses always present in the city grew stronger. Further still, in neighbourhoods like the Lower East Side, the buildings were tenements, 4 and 5 stories of cramped rooms holding families of 6 and 8 and 10 people. The streets here were filled with pushcarts and laundry, strung between buildings and children playing in the gutters. The languages spoken on these streets were not the language of the avenue. They were Yiddish and Italian and German and Polish and Irish-inflected English. The smells were different too. The smells were of cabbage cooking and bread baking and herring and onions and the unwashed press of human bodies in close quarters. Between these two worlds, the avenue and the tenement, was a vast middle territory of boarding houses and modest apartments and respectable streets where shopkeepers and clerks and small professionals lived. This was the territory most New Yorkers occupied. This was the city most New Yorkers knew. The avenue was something they read about in newspapers. The tenements were something they walked past quickly, glancing aside. The newspapers were everywhere. They were the connective tissue of the city. They came out in the morning and the afternoon and sometimes in special evening editions, and they were sold by boys on every corner, boys with thin jackets and loud voices, boys who shouted the headlines so insistently that you could not walk a block without learning the day's news. The papers covered everything. They covered the politics and the crimes and the sports and the weather, and they covered the parties on Fifth Avenue. This last fact was important. The parties on the avenue were not private. They were performed in public through the medium of the society columns. The society columns named the guests. They described the gowns. They listed the menus. They told the readers of the city, the millions of readers who had never set foot inside one of those parlours, exactly what had been served, and exactly who had been seen wearing what, and exactly which young woman had danced with which eligible son. Reading the society columns was like reading a serialised novel. The characters recurred, their stories developed, their fortunes rose and fell across the seasons. To enter the society columns was, for many ambitious young women in the city, the single great desire of their lives. To be named in the column was to exist. To be photographed at a ball was to matter. To have your gown described in print was to have arrived. And so the city in those years was a city of two simultaneous performances. There was the performance of wealth on the avenue, the lit windows and the carriages and the soft yellow lamps. And there was the performance of attention from the rest of the city. The crowds who gathered outside the great houses to watch the carriages arrive, the readers who pored over the columns at breakfast tables in modest apartments uptown. Both performances needed each other. The grand families needed to be watched, because being watched was what made them grand. The watchers needed something to watch, because watching was what made the long days of their own lives feel connected to something larger. Into this city, in the 1850s, came a young woman whose ambitions were larger than her circumstances. She would learn the city. She would study its rhythms. She would observe the difference between belonging and being received, and she would devote her life to closing that distance by whatever means the world made available to her. Her name, the name she chose, was Ida Mayfield. The name she had been born with was something else. Tonight we will come to that. Tonight we will follow her through every chapter of the long invention she made of her own life, and we will sit with her in the small hotel room where the invention finally rested. But first, we must understand something about the people she was trying to join. We must understand what old money meant, and how it differed from new money, and why the difference was, in the world she entered, the most important difference there was. Old money was not measured in dollars. That was the secret of it. Old money was measured in time. A family with old money had held its money long enough that no one remembered exactly where the money had come from. The original source had faded into the past. The land, the trade, the lucky investment, the inheritance from a great aunt in some forgotten generation, all of it had blurred into a vague impression of always having been wealthy. And always having been wealthy was the thing. That was the credential. That was the unforgeable document. New money, by contrast, was loud. It was specific. It came from a steel mill in Pittsburgh or a railroad in the West or a stockyard in Chicago, and everyone knew it had come from there, and the smell of the mill and the dust of the rails and the blood of the yard still clung to it faintly, no matter how many bottles of French perfume the new wife sprayed onto the air of her new house. New money tried very hard. Old money did not try at all. That was the difference. And to a careful observer, The difference was visible in everything from the cut of a coat to the way a person held a teacup. Ida understood this. She understood it from the beginning. She did not try to be new money. She did not try to be loud or specific. She tried, from the very first moment she entered the city, to be old money. She tried to be the kind of woman who had always been wealthy, whose grandfathers had owned plantations, whose name was inscribed in registers older than the Republic. She was none of these things. She had been born to nothing. Her father was a poor immigrant. Her mother kept a small house in a forgettable place. There was no plantation. There were no grandfathers in registers. There was only a young woman with a sharp eye and a soft voice and an extraordinary, unyielding determination to become someone other than the person she had been. The lamps along Fifth Avenue continued to be lit every evening by the man with the long pole. The carriages continued to roll up to the great houses. The newspapers continued to print their columns. And somewhere in the city, in a boarding house perhaps, or in a small parlour she had been allowed to visit, a young woman was practising the accent of the South, the accent of a southern lady from a fine old family. She was practising it carefully, listening to her own voice, smoothing the rough places, softening the consonants, learning to say the names of cities and rivers she had never seen. The lamps burned through the night. The young woman practised. The city went about its business, beautiful and indifferent. And the long story of Ida Mayfield Wood had begun, though no one yet, not even she, could have told you how it would end. It is worth lingering for a while in this New York, the New York of the 1850s and 60s, because this is the city that shaped her, that taught her what was possible and what was not, and that gave her the long, quiet education in the careful arts of social ascent. The city of those decades was already enormous by American standards, though it was still only a fraction of what it would later become. Manhattan was the city mostly. The Bronx was farmland and small villages. Brooklyn was a separate city across the river. Queens was a long stretch of farms and small communities punctuated by the occasional roadhouse. Staten Island was rural and quiet. The boroughs would not be united until 1898, and Ida would be more than half a century old by then. The Manhattan she knew was bounded by water on 3 sides and by the slow advance of buildings on the 4th. The northern edge of the developed city in the 1850s was somewhere around 42nd Street. Above that, the island became increasingly rural. There were squatter camps on the rocky outcroppings of what would become the Upper East and Upper West Sides. Goats grazed in the patches of grass between the rocks. There were small farms, and there were dirt roads, and there were the encampments of working-class families who could not afford to live further south. Central Park, which would later become one of the great urban parks of the world, was being built during these years. The land had been acquired by the city in 1853. The construction began in 1858. For decades, the park was a vast construction site, with thousands of labourers moving earth, planting trees, building bridges, shaping the curves of pathways and ponds. The trees that visitors now know as ancient were, in those years, saplings. The lawns were raw earth waiting to be seeded. The lakes were artificial creations dug by hand lined with clay, slowly filled with water from city sources. Ida would have walked past parts of the park in those years and seen the construction. She would have seen the workers, mostly Irish immigrants like the workers in every other heavy labour in the city. She would have seen, perhaps, men who reminded her of her father and her brothers and the men of the neighbourhood she had left behind. She would have walked past in her quiet way, dressed in the clothes of the woman she was becoming, and she would not have stopped to speak with them because the woman she was becoming did not speak with such men. The streets of the city were, in those years, both grand and squalid. The grandness was on the avenues. Fifth Avenue, which would later become the great parade route of American wealth, was already, by the 1850s and 60s, the address of choice for the wealthy. The houses were large. The lots were wide. The trees, where they had been planted, were beginning to mature. The carriages that rolled along the avenue in the late afternoon hours, when fashionable people took the air, were of the finest make, drawn by matched pairs of horses, polished until they gleamed. The squalor was on the side streets and in the neighbourhoods further east. 5 Points, which would become legendary as one of the most notorious slums in American history, was at its full miserable extent in those years. The streets there were narrow, the buildings packed close together, the population dense beyond anything Americans of more recent generations have ever experienced. Crime was endemic. Disease was constant. Children played in gutters that ran with sewage. The air smelled on hot summer days of things one did not want to think about too clearly. These two extremes existed within a short walk of each other. A person could go from Fifth Avenue to 5 Points in 20 minutes on foot. The city compressed its contradictions into a small geographical space. The wealthy and the poor lived almost shoulder to shoulder, separated by a few blocks, but separated also by an immense gulf of expectation, of opportunity, of the basic dignities of human existence. Crossing from one world to the other was geographically easy. Crossing it socially was nearly impossible. Ida set herself to making that crossing. She would do it not in the obvious direction, the direction of poor people who came into wealthy neighbourhoods looking for work, but in the more difficult direction. She would cross from the world of poverty into the world of wealth, not as a servant or a tradesperson, but as one of the wealthy themselves. The crossing required everything she had. It required her beauty, her intelligence, her patience. It required the long, careful labour of self-construction that would consume her young womanhood and the early decades of her adult life. There were models, of course, for what she was attempting. The American novel of the period was full of stories of social advancement. The newspapers were full of accounts of girls from modest backgrounds who had married into wealth. The opera, which Ida would come to attend regularly in her later, more secure years, was full of stories of mistaken identities, secret origins, peasant girls revealed to be princesses. The whole culture of the 19th century was, in some ways, obsessed with the possibility of moving between classes, the possibility of being something different from what one had been born to be. But the stories were stories. The reality was harder. Most poor girls who tried to marry up failed. Most reinventions were detected eventually, and the detected were sent back to where they had come from. The successful ones, the ones who actually managed to slip through the membrane and live on the other side, were rare. They required a particular combination of attributes, and they required above all a kind of cold, strategic mind that would not be deflected by sentiment or by the small daily pulls of the past. Ida had that mind. We can see it, looking back, in the choices she made. Every choice was strategic. Every choice was directed, with the steady patience of an arrow flying toward its target, at the goal of becoming a wealthy New York lady. She did not waver. She did not, as far as we can tell, indulge in nostalgic returns to her family. She did not, as far as we can tell, fall in love with the wrong man, or take risks that would have exposed her, or allow herself the luxury of being known. She was alone with her project. The project was her companion. The project was, in some ways, her only friend. The city itself was, of course, an endless source of instruction. Walking through the streets in the long afternoon hours, looking carefully at the houses and the people who came in and out of them, Ida would have learned 100 small things every day. She would have learned, for example, what the right hat looked like in a particular season, and what the wrong hat looked like, and how the difference, which was tiny, was nevertheless instantly visible to a trained eye. She would have learned how a lady carried her gloves when she was not wearing them, and how she removed them when she entered a parlour, and how she placed them on the small table in the entry hall in such a way that anyone watching could see without being told that the lady was a lady. These small things, accumulated over years, became second nature. They became, in fact, her nature. The original nature, the nature of the small Irish girl who had grown up in the small rooms in Boston, was buried beneath the new nature, layer by layer, gesture by gesture, until even Ida herself may have forgotten on most days which gestures had been original and which had been acquired. The seasons passed over the city year after year while she did this work. The winters in those decades were colder than the winters of the present time. The Hudson River froze, in the worst winters, hard enough to walk on. The streets were piled with snow that the city's modest snow removal efforts could not entirely clear. The fashionable women of the avenue wore long, fur-trimmed coats and rode in carriages whose wheels had been replaced with runners. The poor wrapped themselves in whatever they could and stamped their feet on the sidewalks waiting for streetcars that came late or did not come at all. The springs were short and unpredictable. There would be a few warm days in late March, and then a sudden return to cold, and then a tentative emergence of leaves in April, and then by the middle of May the trees in the small squares would be in full new leaf, and the city would smell for a few weeks, of the lilacs that bloomed in the back gardens of the old houses. The avenue in those weeks was at its most beautiful. The light in late afternoon slanted through the new leaves and fell on the brownstone facades and turned the stone the colour of warm honey. The fashionable people came out for their walks. The carriages rolled. The whole city seemed, for those few weeks, to be celebrating its survival of another winter. The summers were hot. They were hot in a way that modern New Yorkers, with their air-conditioned apartments and their cooled subway cars, can hardly imagine. The heat in the tenements, in the worst weeks of August, became unbearable. People slept on the fire escapes, on the rooftops, in the small parks where there was at least the suggestion of moving air. The wealthy, of course, left. They left for Newport, for Saratoga, for the seaside cottages on Long Island, for the cooler hills of the Berkshires and the Adirondacks. The avenue emptied. The houses were closed up, the shutters drawn, the staff reduced to a skeleton crew of caretakers. For 2 or 3 months in the deep heat, Fifth Avenue was a strangely quiet place, the lamps still being lit each evening, but lighting up an avenue that was no longer being walked. The autumns were the most beautiful season. The city had been planted over the decades with a great variety of trees, and many of them turned splendid colours in October. The maples flamed red and orange, the ginkgos turned a clear lemon yellow. The leaves drifted down across the avenues, and the wind blew them into the gutters, and the children gathered them up in great piles and played in them until the gaslights came on at dusk. The wealthy returned from their summer places. The houses opened. The first parties of the season were planned. The whole machine of the social year began again, with a fresh enthusiasm, with new dresses, with the latest gossip about who had spent the summer where and with whom. Ida watched all of this. She watched it through her years of patient apprenticeship to the city, and she watched it again in the years of her brief social ascendancy after her marriage, and she watched it, finally, only through her newspapers, in the long decades of her retreat. The city she had studied so carefully had become, in some sense, the only city she would ever know, the only setting for the only life she would ever lead. Other cities existed in her imagination. New Orleans, where her invented family had supposedly lived, was a vivid fiction in her mind. London and Paris, which she had perhaps visited briefly during the years of her marriage, were memories of a few weeks. But New York was the substance. New York was the place where the long invention had been built and the long retreat had been conducted. New York was, for better or for worse, her one true home. To understand the woman who would later sit in a darkened hotel room with $1 million in cash, we must travel backward in time, and we must travel away from New York, all the way across the Atlantic Ocean to a small island off the western coast of Europe. We must travel to Ireland. The Ireland of the 1830s and 40s was a country shaped by hardship. It was beautiful, of course. The light came down across the fields in the soft slanting way that Irish light has always come down. The hedgerows were green even in winter. The stone walls ran along the slopes of the hills like the seams of a long quilt, marking out the small fields that had been worked by the same families for generations. The smell of peat smoke drifted from the chimneys of low whitewashed cottages, and the smell of the sea was always present, no matter how far inland you travelled, because Ireland is a small country and the sea is never very far away. But the beauty of the country was set against a deep and grinding poverty. Most of the land in Ireland did not belong to the people who lived on it. It belonged to absentee landlords, English aristocrats, and Anglo-Irish gentlemen who lived in London or Dublin and collected rents from tenant farmers they had often never met. The tenant farmers worked small plots, paid their rents, and survived on what little remained, which in most cases was potatoes. The potato had become, by the 1840s, the central food of the Irish poor. It grew well in the rocky soil. It could feed a family from a small patch of ground. It was nourishing when there was enough of it. It was almost the only thing many families ever ate. In the autumn of 1845, the potato crop began to fail. A blight, a fungus that would not be properly understood by science for many years, swept across the fields and turned the potatoes black in the ground. Whole crops rotted overnight. The smell hung over the country like the smell of a great wound. The next year was worse. The year after that was worse still. By 1847, which the Irish would come to call Black 47, the country was in the grip of a famine the likes of which Western Europe had not seen in centuries. 1 million people died. 1 million more emigrated. The population of Ireland was reduced in the space of a few years by nearly a quarter. The boats sailed out of every port on the western coast, packed with families who had sold everything they owned for the price of a passage to North America. Liverpool, Cork, Galway, Sligo. The boats left, and they did not bring people back. Most of those who boarded them never saw Ireland again. The boats themselves were terrible. They were called coffin ships, and the name was earned. They were old, often unfit for ocean travel. They were overcrowded. The food was bad. The water was worse. Disease moved through the lower decks with the ease of a thing that had been waiting its whole life for such an opportunity. Typhus, dysentery, cholera. People who had survived the famine on land died at sea. They were buried, when they died on the boats, by being lowered into the water in canvas sacks weighted with stones. Among the people who left Ireland in those years, in some boat or other, on some passage that history did not bother to record in detail, was a man named Thomas Walsh. He came from somewhere in the west of Ireland. The exact place is not certain. He arrived in North America with very little, as nearly everyone did, and he made his way eventually to the city of Boston, where there was work for an Irishman who was willing to take whatever work was offered. Thomas Walsh married a woman named Anne. The records of where and when are imperfect. Together they had several children. One of those children, a daughter, was born around 1838, though even her birth date would later become a matter of careful obscurity. They named her Ellen Walsh. That is the name. The name Ida Mayfield Wood was born with. Ellen Walsh, daughter of Thomas Walsh, an Irish immigrant of modest means, and his wife Anne. A girl from a Boston Irish family in the years when being Irish in Boston meant something very specific and not very easy. The city of Boston in the 1840s and 50s was not kind to the Irish. Signs hung in shop windows that said no Irish need apply. The neighbourhoods where the Irish lived were poor and crowded, and the diseases that thrive in poor and crowded neighbourhoods thrived there. The accents marked them. The Catholicism marked them. The poverty marked them. They were the bottom rung of a city that was fiercely committed to its own social hierarchy, and they knew it, and the people above them knew it, and the knowledge sat over the whole arrangement like a low ceiling that everyone had learned to walk beneath. Ellen grew up in this world. The details of her childhood are mostly lost to us, because she would later spend an enormous amount of effort ensuring that those details were lost. But we can imagine the shape of it. We can imagine the small rooms, the smell of cabbage and potatoes, and the strong tea the Irish drank at every meal. We can imagine the wooden floors worn smooth by feet, the iron stove that heated the kitchen and was the warmest room in the house, the shared bedrooms where children slept 2 and 3 to a bed. We can imagine the church on Sunday mornings, the priest in his black cassock, the long Latin words that meant nothing to Ellen and everything to her parents. The family was poor. Thomas Walsh worked at whatever he could find. There is some indication he was a hat maker, or perhaps worked for a hat maker, in the small industries that employed Irish labour in Boston in those years. The work was hard. The pay was modest. The family lived close to the edge of survival, the way most Irish families in Boston live close to that edge. But Ellen, even as a young girl, was different. She was watching, she was listening, she was learning. She was, by all accounts, a strikingly beautiful child. She had dark hair and clear eyes and a small, neat face, and the kind of quiet poise that you sometimes see in children who have been observing adults very carefully from a young age. She was intelligent. She picked up things quickly. She listened to the way different people spoke. She noticed the differences between the speech of her own family and the speech of the Boston Brahmins, whose carriages sometimes passed through the better parts of the city. She noticed the way the Brahmin women held themselves, the way they walked, the way they sat down in a chair. She was not, even as a small girl, content with the world she'd been born into. Around her the family struggled. The years passed. There was a brother and there were sisters, though some of them died young, as many children did in those years, in those neighbourhoods. Childhood mortality among the Irish poor in Boston was staggering by modern standards. A family might lose 2 or 3 children before any of them reached the age of 10. The fevers came, the influenzas, the consumptions. The children went to small graves in Catholic cemeteries on the outskirts of the city, and the families lit candles for them in the parish churches and tried to go on. Ellen survived. She grew. She moved from a small girl into a young woman, and as she did, the beauty that had been remarkable in her as a child became extraordinary. She had what people of the time called striking features: the dark hair, the pale skin, the small refined nose, the large expressive eyes. She had a slim figure and held herself well, and when she walked into a room, even into the modest rooms her family could afford to be in, people noticed her. She must have noticed them noticing. This is perhaps the moment when the long invention began. We cannot know exactly when. There is no diary, no letter, no reliable witness. But somewhere in her early adolescence, in the rooms of that Irish family in Boston, Ellen Walsh seems to have made a decision. She seems to have decided that the life laid out for her, the life of an Irish daughter who would marry an Irish husband and raise Irish children in a poor Irish neighbourhood, was not the life she would lead. She would lead a different one. She would lead a life that was, as far as anyone in that other life would ever know, entirely separate from the life she'd been born into. The plan was audacious. It was in fact almost impossible. To leave one's class in the 19th century was extraordinarily difficult. The class system was rigid. The markers of class, including accent, manners, education, family connections, and even posture, were so deeply embedded that they were almost impossible to fake convincingly. A poor Irish girl who tried to pass herself off as a wealthy young lady would be detected within minutes by anyone who actually was a wealthy young lady. The mistakes would be too many. The accent would slip. The manners would falter. The whole performance would collapse. But Ellen had three things going for her. She had the beauty, which opened doors that would have been closed to a less beautiful girl. She had the intelligence, which allowed her to learn quickly and to remember what she had learned. And she had a kind of cold-blooded patience, a willingness to plan and to wait and to refine her performance over years rather than days that very few people possessed. Ireland would never see her again. Boston would see her only briefly. The Walsh family, the Catholic Church, the small rooms and the strong tea would all be left behind. They would be left so completely behind that, when she died, her own great-niece would not know who she really was. The transformation began slowly. The first step was the family moving from Boston to New York. We do not know exactly when. We do not know exactly why. Such moves were common in those years among the Irish. New York offered more opportunities, more anonymity, a larger stage. The family arrived. They settled. They tried, as they had tried in Boston, to make a life. And in New York, Ellen Walsh, the Irish girl from a poor family, began the process of becoming someone else. She began by leaving home. The exact circumstances are unclear, but at some point in her late teens or very early 20s she departed from her family. She would later have very little contact with them, and what contact she did have would be conducted at arm's length, through carefully managed channels and on her own strict terms. She did not bring her family with her into the new life. She left them in the old one like furniture too heavy to move. Then she began to assemble a name. Mayfield, the name she chose for herself. It is hard to know now where she found it. Perhaps she heard it somewhere. Perhaps she read it in a novel. Perhaps she simply liked the sound of it, the soft, pleasant weight of it, the way it suggested, without quite saying so, an old plantation in Louisiana or Mississippi, a family with land and with cotton, and with the deep green legacy of the antebellum South. Ida, her first name, also chosen. Ida sounded soft. It sounded vaguely European, vaguely refined. It did not sound Irish. It did not sound Catholic. It did not sound poor. It sounded like the name of a young woman whose family had owned a piano for 3 generations. Ida Mayfield. And to this newly assembled name she attached a newly assembled history. She was, she would tell people, the daughter of a wealthy sugar planter from Louisiana. Her father, Henry Mayfield, was a gentleman of southern stock. Her family was old, established, of the proper kind. She had come to New York for reasons that varied depending on the listener, but the reasons were always elegant, always plausible, always painted in the soft colours of southern gentility. None of it was true. The Mayfield plantation did not exist. The Louisiana sugar fortune did not exist. Henry Mayfield, gentleman of the South, did not exist. But Ida Mayfield, in the city of New York in the 1850s, very much existed, and she had set herself a project, and she would pursue that project for the rest of her long, strange, unprecedented life. The country she had come from, Ireland, would not be mentioned. Boston would not be mentioned. The Walsh family, with all its hardships and its love and its small rooms in poor neighbourhoods, would not be mentioned. They would be erased, as completely as a child's drawing is erased from a slate, and over the erased surface a new picture would be drawn. The new picture was beautiful. It was carefully composed. It would deceive almost everyone who looked at it for almost the entire length of her life. And the woman who drew it, the woman who would become Ida Mayfield Wood, sat down in a boarding house in New York, in some quiet room we cannot now picture exactly, and began the long, patient work of becoming someone else. The work was slow. The work was perhaps slower and more patient than any work most of us ever undertake. To change one's accent fully and convincingly takes years of constant attention. The voice has to be retrained, sound by sound, syllable by syllable, until the new accent comes naturally even in moments of fatigue or surprise. The old accent has to be suppressed even in the most private moments, because the moment one allows it back in any context, it begins to creep back into the public voice. Ida could not allow herself to speak in her old voice even when alone. She could not, perhaps, allow herself to think in her old voice. The substitution had to be total. To change one's manners is similarly slow. There are 1,000 small gestures that mark a person's class. The way one holds a cup, the way one sits in a chair, the way one speaks to a servant or a shopkeeper or a stranger on the street, the way one enters and leaves a room, the way one acknowledges or fails to acknowledge other people in public spaces. Each of these gestures has to be observed in the people one wishes to imitate and then practiced alone until the imitation becomes second nature. Ida did this. She did it with the patience of a person who has nothing else to do. She practiced perhaps in front of mirrors. She practiced perhaps in the small parlour of whatever boarding house she was living in. She practiced perhaps at the windows of shops, watching her own reflection in the glass and adjusting her posture to match the posture of the well-dressed women on the avenue. She practiced when she was alone. She practiced when she was with other people. She practiced, in some sense, every waking moment for years. She also studied. She read books. She read novels by Southern writers, partly to learn the cadences of Southern speech, partly to absorb the small details of Southern domestic life that she might one day need to refer to in conversation. She read history. She read the journals of Southern travellers. She read, perhaps, the agricultural press, learning enough about cotton and sugar and the management of plantations to be able to make intelligent reference to such things when the subject arose. She built up brick by brick a body of knowledge that would allow her to sustain her invented identity in a wide range of conversational situations. She also, and this is harder to document but seems certain from the result, decided what she would not say. There were topics she would not discuss. There were memories she would not share. There were questions she would deflect. The list of forbidden subjects was, perhaps, long. Ireland, of course, Boston, the Catholic Church, the hatmaker's bench, the names of the streets where she had grown up, the names of the schools, if she had attended schools, that she had been to as a child. All of these had to be sealed off. They had to be kept out of her conversation, out of her social presence, out of the available material of her public self. This kind of vigilance, sustained over years, becomes a kind of habit. It becomes second nature, like breathing. The person who lives with it for long enough no longer feels the strain of keeping the secret, because the secret has been pushed so deep beneath the surface that it does not, on most days, threaten to emerge. But the strain is not gone. It is simply hidden. It is paid, perhaps, in the form of a certain inwardness, a certain reserve, a certain quality that other people might describe, looking at the woman who carried it, as dignity or as quiet refinement. But that was actually the shape that constant vigilance leaves on a personality over time. Ida had this quality. She had it markedly. The few descriptions that survive of her, from people who met her in her social years, mention her composure, her stillness, her habit of speaking quietly and deliberately. These were not perhaps the natural traits of the small Irish girl in the small Boston rooms. They were the acquired traits of the woman who had spent decades guarding herself against any slip that might give her away. The composure was real. It was just that it had been earned, the hard way, through the long discipline of self-construction. The letter arrived at the offices of the New York Daily News in the early 1850s. It came in an envelope addressed in a careful, sloping hand, and the editor of the paper opened it as he had opened countless letters before, expecting nothing in particular, expecting perhaps a complaint about an article, or a request for an obituary or a small notice of a meeting somewhere uptown. What he found instead was a love letter. Not a love letter in the explicit sense. The letter was not declarative, it was not improper. It was, on its surface, a perfectly respectable letter from a young lady to a public figure she admired. It was, beneath that surface, an introduction so artfully constructed that it would change the course of two lives. The editor of the Daily News was a man named Benjamin Wood. He was the younger brother of Fernando Wood, the mayor of New York. The Wood brothers were, in their way, a kind of New York royalty of the period. They were political men, ambitious men with their fingers in many enterprises. Fernando was a Democrat of the Tammany variety, a man who had risen through the rough machinery of New York City politics to occupy the highest office in the city. Benjamin had built a newspaper, and through it had built influence of his own. He was a writer, an editor, a speculator on Wall Street. He was, by every measure of the period, a man on the rise. He was also married. His wife was a woman named Delia, and they had been married for some years. There were no children, which was, in that era, often a source of quiet sorrow in a household, though we do not know what feelings filled the Wood marriage in those particular years. Delia was, by all surviving accounts, a woman of conventional virtues. She was a wife. She kept a house. She did the things wives in the 1850s were expected to do. The letter Benjamin Wood opened that day was signed Ida Mayfield. It came from a young woman in New York, a young woman of, the letter implied, refinement and education. The young woman wrote that she had been reading the Daily News with great admiration. She wrote that she found the editor's articles to be of the highest calibre. She wrote with delicacy that she would be honoured to make his acquaintance. The letter was not the kind of letter a respectable young woman of the period would normally have written. Respectable young women did not, as a rule, write to married men in newspapers requesting introductions. There was a propriety that governed such things, and the propriety was strict. But the letter was so carefully phrased, so artfully balanced between admiration and modesty, that it slipped beneath the propriety like a key sliding into the right lock. Benjamin Wood read the letter, he read it again, and he wrote back. It is interesting to consider what he saw in the letter that drew him to write back. He was a busy man. He received many letters. Most of them he had handled quickly, with brief replies dictated to a clerk or with no reply at all. This letter, for whatever reason, struck him differently. Perhaps it was the careful handwriting. Perhaps it was the precise balance of the phrasing, which suggested an educated person without quite saying so. Perhaps it was the small details that hinted at a particular kind of background, a background that would have been interesting to a New York editor in the 1850s. Perhaps it was simply that the letter caught him on a day when he had time to read it carefully, and the reading produced a response in him that another day might not have produced. Whatever the cause, he wrote back, and the writing back was the small hinge on which the next 60 years of Ida's life would turn. So much of any life, perhaps, depends on these small hinges, a letter that arrives at the right moment, a reply that is sent rather than not sent, a meeting that takes place that might not have taken place. The great structure of a long life rests, very often, on small contingent moments that could easily have gone the other way. Ida had created the contingent moment by writing the letter. Benjamin had completed it by responding. Between them, in those few exchange sheets of paper, the rest of the story was being launched. Whatever he wrote, it produced a meeting. The meeting produced more meetings. The more meetings produced, in time, an arrangement. We must pause here, because the arrangement is the central fact of Ida's early adulthood, and the arrangement is one of those things that the 19th century did not entirely have language for, and that the 20th century, when it discovered the documents, did not entirely have language for either. Ida Mayfield, the young woman from a poor Irish family in Boston, the young woman who had reinvented herself as a Southern belle, became the long-term mistress of Benjamin Wood, the editor of the Daily News and brother of the mayor of New York. She did not become his wife, because he already had a wife. She became, instead, his second household. He maintained Delia in their proper home. He maintained Ida in another home, a separate establishment, paid for and supported by him. The arrangement lasted for years. It was, in the careful coded way of the era, an open secret. The people who needed to know knew. The people who did not need to know were not told. Ida lived comfortably. She had her own house, her own staff, her own carriage when she needed one. Benjamin came to see her, and Benjamin was, by every account, devoted to her. He found her beautiful. He found her intelligent. He found her, perhaps most importantly, fascinating. The carefully constructed Ida Mayfield, with her southern accent and her plantation backstory and her refined manners, was a creation Benjamin enjoyed being in the presence of. Whether or not he knew the truth beneath the creation is a question we cannot fully answer. He may have known. He may have suspected. He may have decided, as a man of the world, that some questions were best left unasked. The arrangement produced a daughter. Her name was Emma. She was born sometime around 1857, though her exact birth date, like so many things in Ida's life, would be carefully obscured. Emma was raised as Ida's daughter and Benjamin's, and the arrangement of the household made room for her, in the way that 19th century arrangements often made room for inconvenient children by simply not asking too many questions. Years passed. Delia died in 1866. The exact circumstances of her death are not particularly remarkable for the period. She had been ill the way many women of the period were ill, with the slow accumulation of small ailments that 19th century medicine could not address. She died at home. She was buried with proper ceremony. Benjamin observed the period of mourning that propriety required, and then, when the period of mourning was complete, he married Ida. The wedding was small, the wedding was quiet. The wedding was, in the social calculus of the day, a kind of regularization of an arrangement that everyone had already known about but had been pretending not to know about. Ida Mayfield, the young woman from the Irish family in Boston, became Ida Mayfield Wood, the wife of one of the most prominent men in New York City. She had done it. The first phase of her project was complete. She had married into a family that had political power, financial resources, and a certain rough-edged but undeniable place in the city's hierarchy. She had a name, she had a house, she had a husband who, whatever his complications, treated her with affection and with respect. She had a daughter who would grow up with privileges Ellen Walsh could never have dreamed of providing. The Wood household, after the marriage, was active. Benjamin continued to run the daily news. He continued to invest. He served, eventually, in Congress, representing a district in New York. The household entertained. They had visitors. The visitors were politicians and journalists and businessmen, and, on the right occasions, members of New York society. Society was the next mountain. Society was the great achievement Ida had set herself to climb. Marriage to Benjamin Wood had placed her on the lower slopes. It had made her acceptable. It had not, however, made her welcome at the highest tables. The Wood family, for all its prominence, was not old money. Benjamin's father had been a merchant. His grandfather had been a tradesman. The family had risen through commerce and politics, and there was always, in the eyes of the truly old families, a faint trace of newness about them. They were respectable. They were not, in the strictest sense, ancient. Ida set herself to overcoming this. She did so by the methods she had been refining since her girlhood. She studied, she observed, she listened, she practiced. She read the society columns with the dedication of a scholar reading a sacred text. She memorized the names of the leading families. She memorized their connections. She memorized their houses, their summer places, their boats, their stables. She memorized the names of their cooks and their dressmakers, and the schools their children attended. When she met someone from one of these families, she was prepared. She knew what to ask about. She knew what to compliment. She knew what to never, under any circumstances, mention. She also studied dress. Dress in the 1860s and 70s was an enormously complex language. The cut of a sleeve, the fabric of a skirt, the choice of trim, all of it spoke. A woman who knew how to dress was a woman who could enter rooms. A woman who did not know how to dress could not, no matter how much money she spent. Ida learned the language. She found dressmakers. She had her gowns made in the styles that the most fashionable women were wearing, but always slightly adjusted, slightly toned down, in the manner of a woman who has had money long enough that she does not need to flaunt it. She wore the right jewels. She did her hair the right way. She entered rooms quietly, and she left rooms before the parties were over, in the manner of someone who has many other places to be. The performance was extraordinary. It was sustained over years. It convinced almost everyone. It was assisted by Benjamin's position. As his political career advanced, as the Daily News grew in influence, as his investments paid out, the Wood household became one of the households that had to be acknowledged. They could not be ignored. The invitations that mattered began to arrive. The invitations to the right balls, the right dinners, the right boxes at the opera. Ida attended them all. She moved through those rooms like a woman who had been moving through such rooms her entire life. She was, in those years, photographed occasionally. The photographs that survive show a slim, dark-haired woman with a composed face and very direct eyes. She looks, in the photographs, like exactly what she was claiming to be. She looks like a southern lady from a fine old family. The performance had become the woman. There was no daylight in the photographs between Ellen Walsh and Ida Mayfield Wood. The first had been entirely subsumed by the second. It is worth pausing here before moving forward to consider what the long act of self-construction must have cost her. The reinvention was not free. It came with a price, and the price was paid daily, in small increments, across decades. The first cost was the loss of family. Ellen Walsh had been part of a family. She had had parents who, whatever their limitations, loved her. She had had brothers and sisters who shared her childhood, who knew the smells and sounds of her childhood home, who could have in another life been her companions through the long years of her adulthood. To become Ida Mayfield, she had to give all of them up. She had to stop visiting. She had to stop writing. She had to stop knowing about their lives, because to know about their lives would be to risk being drawn back into the orbit of who she had been. The mother who had borne her, the father who had worked at the hatmaker's bench, the brothers who had played with her in the small streets, the sisters who had shared her bed in the small rooms, all of them had to be left behind. Not just physically left behind, but left behind in some deeper way, in the sense of being removed from the active emotional life of the woman she was becoming. The Walsh family, after a certain point, simply could not be in her thoughts. They could not be allowed in. To allow them in would have been to crack the surface of the new identity. So they were sealed off. They were placed in the rooms of her mind, behind doors that she did not open. This is a quiet kind of cost, but it is a real one. To have a family and to choose to live as if one does not have a family is a particular form of grief. The grief never resolves. The family members do not die exactly in the way they would die if they actually died. They continue to exist in some other place, going about their own lives, but unreachable, unmentioned, unseen. The grief for them is the grief for people who are still alive but who have, by an act of will, been removed from one's life. Such a grief has no funeral. It has no period of mourning. It simply settles like a dust in the lungs and stays there. The second cost was the loss of authenticity. Ida could never, after the construction was complete, be entirely herself with anyone. The new identity was always present in the back of her mind, requiring monitoring. The accent had to be maintained. The references had to be controlled. The casual conversation had to be steered gently, away from the topics that might lead to questions. There could be no slipping. There could be no relaxed evening with old friends, because there were no old friends. The old friends were all in Boston, in the Irish neighbourhoods, in the lives she had left behind. The new friends, the friends of Mrs. Wood, knew only the Mrs. Wood version of her. They knew the constructed person. They did not know, and could not know, the person beneath. To live this way for 40 years must have been very lonely. Not lonely in the obvious sense. Ida was surrounded by people. She had a husband, she had a daughter, she had her sister. She had servants and acquaintances and the whole social network she had constructed. But the loneliness of being unknown is a particular kind of loneliness. It is the loneliness of the person whose true self never gets to be in the room. It is the loneliness of the actor who is never off stage. It is the loneliness of having a secret that no one else can be told, and that therefore, in some essential sense, isolates the secret keeper from everyone they know. Mary perhaps was the one exception. Mary had known the original Ellen. Mary had been there in the rooms in Boston. Mary remembered the parents and the brothers and the small streets. With Mary, perhaps, Ida could occasionally allow some small portion of the original self to exist. With Mary, she did not have to perform. This is perhaps the deeper reason that Mary was kept close. Mary was not just a sister. Mary was a witness. Mary was the only person in the constructed world who knew that the world was constructed. To have such a witness in a life of permanent performance is precious. It is not the same as having an authentic self. But it is something. It is the small relief of being known by at least one person in something approaching the original truth. So Ida kept Mary. So Ida brought Mary into every household she ever maintained. So Ida, when she finally retreated into the rooms at the Herald Square Hotel, brought Mary with her. The two sisters, the original Ellen and the original other sister, whose actual first name has been almost erased from the historical record by Ida's renaming of her, would live together to the end. They would be, in their strange way, the last carriers of the truth that the rest of the world had not been allowed to know. The third cost was a cost that Ida may not have fully recognised, even at the end. The third cost was the cost to whoever the original Ellen Walsh would have become if she had been allowed to develop without the great project of reinvention. There is in any life the question of what life would have been if the major decisions had gone differently. Ellen Walsh, the small girl in the Boston rooms, had within her the seeds of many possible lives. She might have become a different kind of woman, with a different husband, a different family, a different set of friends, a different shape of soul. The Ida Mayfield Wood who emerged from the long construction was one possible Ellen Walsh, but only one. The others were never given the chance to grow. This is true of every life, of course. Every life involves the foreclosure of other lives that might have been. But Ida's case is unusual, in that the foreclosure was so deliberate, so total. She did not merely take one path among many. She actively suppressed all the other paths, sealed them off, made sure they could not be recovered. The Ellen Walsh who might have stayed in Boston, who might have married an Irishman, who might have raised her children among her family and her people, who might have had a smaller and more ordinary and possibly happier life, never got to exist. She was killed, in a sense, by the woman who took her place. This is a hard thing to consider. It is the kind of thing one considers only late at night, in a quiet room, when the small voices of the unrealized possibilities of one's own life come whispering in. We all have such voices. We all have the lives we did not lead. Ida's voices were unusually numerous and unusually decisively silenced. But every person who has made significant life choices has versions of these voices. They are part of being human. They are part of the price of becoming any particular self at all. Ida, for whatever reasons of temperament and circumstance, made her choices early and held them fiercely. She did not look back. She did not, as far as the record shows, second guess. She had decided who she would be, and she became that person, and she stayed that person against every pressure that the world threw at her. There was also money. There was increasingly a great deal of money. Benjamin Wood was a speculator. He invested in stocks, in real estate, in various ventures. His investments did well. He was also, less reputably, a gambler. He played cards. He bet on horses. He bet on elections. He bet on, by some accounts, almost anything that could be bet on. The gambling was risky, but Benjamin was in those years a man with the kind of luck that gamblers sometimes have for long stretches before it leaves them. The wins outweighed the losses. The household grew wealthier. And here is where Ida revealed something about herself that would become more important in the long arc of her life than anything else. Ida liked money. She liked it not in the way that the spendthrift liked it, not as a thing to be deployed in lavish display. She liked it in the way that the careful and the patient liked it. She liked it as something to be held. She liked it as something to be gathered up. She liked it as something that, once acquired, should never be allowed to leave one's possession. She made an arrangement with Benjamin. The arrangement was simple. Whenever he won at gambling, whenever he made money in some venture, he was to give her half. She would manage that half. She would keep it. She would, she made clear, not be spending it on dresses or houses or any of the visible forms of wealth that other women favoured. She would simply hold it. Benjamin agreed. He may have found the arrangement charming. He may have found it prudent. He may have suspected in some part of his mind that his luck would not last forever, and that having a portion of his earnings safely tucked away with his wife was a reasonable form of insurance against the day his luck turned. Whatever his reasons, he agreed. He honoured the arrangement. The money began to accumulate. Cash, mostly. Ida preferred cash. She did not entirely trust banks, in the way that many people of her generation did not entirely trust banks, having lived through panics and bank failures that had wiped out fortunes overnight. She kept some of the money in banks, of course. She had to. But she also kept a great deal of it in the house, in drawers, in trunks, in small, carefully chosen hiding places that only she knew about. The money in the drawers and the trunks would eventually become legendary. It would become, in the final act of her long life, the central fact of her existence. But in those years, in the 1870s and 80s, it was simply a quiet practice, a habit, a peculiarity of Mrs. Wood's that her servants noticed but did not discuss. The marriage continued, the household entertained, the daughter Emma grew up, the years passed. And Ida Mayfield Wood, the daughter of an Irish hatmaker named Thomas Walsh, sat in her parlour on her good upholstered chair and poured tea from a silver pot for the wives of senators and bankers and old New York families, and she spoke to them in the soft accent of a southern lady, and not one of them, as far as we know, ever suspected that she was anything other than what she said she was. The performance had become so complete that even she may have forgotten in some compartments of her mind that it was a performance. But of course she had not forgotten. She could not forget. The truth was always there, beneath everything, like the foundation of a house. And Ida, who had built the house with her own two hands, knew exactly what the foundation was made of. She kept gathering the money. She kept watching the markets. She kept reading the newspapers and the financial columns and the small notices of bank failures and panics. She was preparing for something, though she could not yet have said what. She was preparing the way a sailor prepares for a storm, knowing that storms come, knowing that the wise sailor has made his preparations long before the first cloud appears on the horizon. The Wood household, in those years, looked from the outside like a happy and successful household of the period. From the inside, Ida sat at the centre of it, calm, watchful, quietly counting. It is worth slowing down here, in the long middle of her life, to consider what the daily texture of those years would have felt like. We tend, when we tell stories like this one, to compress decades into single sentences. The household entertained. The years passed, the money accumulated, but each of those compressed sentences contains in fact thousands and thousands of ordinary days, and each of those ordinary days had its own particular weather, its own particular small events, its own quiet flavour. In the morning, in the Wood house, the day would have begun before Ida did. Servants would have risen at 4 or 5 o'clock. The fires would have been laid. The kitchen would have come to life, with the cook beginning the long preparation of the day's meals, with kitchen maids hauling water and scrubbing floors, and beginning the slow patient work of feeding a household that included the family, the servants themselves, and any guests who happened to be staying. The smell of bacon and bread would have filled the lower floors of the house long before Ida woke. She would have slept in those years in a large bed in a large bedroom on one of the upper floors. The bed would have had a heavy frame of dark wood. The mattress would have been a thick affair of horsehair and ticking. The pillows would have been linen-cased, plumped each morning by the maid. The room would have been wallpapered in some careful pattern of small flowers or stripes, with a fireplace, with heavy curtains that kept the dawnlight out, with a dressing table where Ida's brushes and combs and small porcelain pots of cream and powder were arranged in their proper places. When she woke, she would have rung a bell. The maid would have come. The maid would have brought tea. The maid would have drawn back the curtains just enough to let in the soft morning light, and would have laid out the dress Ida had decided on the night before. The dressing of a respectable lady of the period was not a quick affair. It involved corsets, layers of petticoats, the careful arrangement of skirts, the attention to small fastenings and trim. A lady did not dress herself ordinarily. A lady was dressed by a maid who had been trained in the precise tasks involved. Then there would have been breakfast. Breakfast in a household of the Wood standing was not the casual affair of toast and coffee that breakfast has become in modern times. It was a substantial meal, with multiple dishes laid out on a sideboard, with kippers and eggs and chops and breads and preserves and tea and coffee, with the morning newspapers folded next to the place settings. Benjamin would have read the political pages and the editorial pages of his own paper. Ida would have read, with her particular focus, the financial pages and the society columns. They would have spoken, perhaps, about the news. They would have planned, perhaps, the dinners and visits of the coming days. Then the morning would have unfolded. There were always things to be done. The household ran on a schedule. The cook had to be consulted about menus. The housekeeper had to be consulted about supplies. There were tradesmen who came to the back door, the butcher's boy with his cart of meat, the iceman with his great blocks of ice for the icebox, the milkman in the early morning hours leaving bottles on the steps. Each of these small commercial transactions had to be managed by someone on behalf of the household. In smaller households, the woman of the house managed them directly. In a household of the Woods standing, the woman of the house supervised the housekeeper who managed them. Ida supervised. She did it well. She had learned over the years the particular rhythms of running a substantial household. She knew what should cost what. She knew which suppliers were reliable and which were not. She knew when the linen needed to be replaced, and when the silver needed to be polished, and when the carpets needed to be beaten in the small backyard by a man hired specifically for the purpose. She knew how to give instructions clearly. She knew, perhaps most importantly, how to listen to her servants without seeming to listen, picking up the small currents of information that flowed through any household, and that a wise mistress used to manage her affairs. The afternoons were for visits. In the social code of the period, ladies of a certain station paid calls on each other in the early afternoon hours. The calls were brief. They were ceremonial. Cards were left at the door if the lady of the house was not receiving. If she was receiving, the visitor was shown into the parlour, where tea was served, where small, polite conversation was conducted for 15 or 20 minutes, where the visitor then took her leave. A lady might pay 3 or 4 such calls in an afternoon. The whole structure was a network of small social obligations, of ties to be maintained, of relationships to be tended. Ida paid her calls. She received calls in return. The calls were one of the great mechanisms by which she built her position in society. Each call was a small statement. Each card left at the door was a small claim. The accumulation of calls over years was the construction of a social network, the laying down of the relationships that would, in time, allow her to be acknowledged at the great houses, invited to the great dinners, named in the right columns. The evenings in the Wood household varied. Sometimes the family dined alone. Sometimes there were guests, a small dinner of 6 or 8 people. Sometimes there were larger dinners, a dozen or more, requiring careful planning and the full deployment of the household's resources. The dinners were, like everything else in 19th century social life, structured by precise codes. The seating arrangements at table mattered. The progression of courses mattered. The wines, the conversation, the moment when the ladies withdrew to the drawing room and left the men to their port and cigars, all of it followed scripts that had been written long before Ida was born and that she had carefully memorized. Then there was bed. The maid came back. The dress was removed. The hair was brushed out. The nightgown was put on. The fire in the bedroom was banked for the night. The lamps were turned down. The household slowly settled into its night silence. Outside, the city continued its noise. The rattle of late carriages on the cobblestones, the calls of the night watchman, the distant sounds of a city that never entirely slept. Inside, in her large bed, Ida lay down to whatever sleep her busy mind would allow her, and gathered herself perhaps for the next day's continuation of the long, careful work. This was the texture of her life, year after year. The pattern repeated with small variations through the 1860s and 70s and 80s. The pattern repeated through the years of her daughter's growing up, through the years of her social ascent, through the years of her quiet accumulation of cash. The pattern repeated until eventually the pattern itself began to shift, until the great house grew less central, until the dinners grew rarer, until the household, by stages, contracted toward the smaller arrangement that would eventually become her final retreat. But for many years, the pattern held. The mornings, the calls, the dinners, the nights, the respectable, demanding, carefully managed life of a wealthy New York lady at the end of the 19th century. Ida lived it well. She lived it, in fact, beautifully. The girl who had practiced her accent in some forgotten boarding house had become, completely, the woman who could host a senator's wife to tea without ever giving anyone reason to wonder where she had originally come from. There were 3 of them in the household in the years that followed, 3 women who would, in the end, all live their lives together and all die together in ways that none of them could have predicted at the beginning. The first was Ida herself, mistress of the household, the wife of Benjamin Wood, the southern lady from the imaginary plantation. The second was Emma, Ida's daughter, the child born in the years before her parents' marriage, the child who had been raised in the careful arrangement of the second household and had then been folded into the first when the first became available. Emma was, by all accounts, a quiet child and a quiet young woman. She did not attract attention. She did not, like her mother, have the striking beauty that opens doors. She was pleasant-looking. She was well-dressed. She moved through the rooms of her parents' house like a young woman who'd been told, very gently and very persistently, that her role was to be present without quite being noticed. The third was Mary, and Mary is the figure in this story whom history has nearly forgotten, because Ida arranged for her to be forgotten, because Ida arranged for everything inconvenient to be forgotten. But Mary is important. She is one of the threads in the long quilt of this story that we must not let drop. Mary was Ida's sister, or more precisely, Mary was Ellen Walsh's sister. Mary had been born into the same Irish family in Boston, the same small house, the same poverty, the same Catholic church on Sunday mornings. She was younger than Ida by a number of years. We do not know exactly how many. Like everything else about the Walsh family, the dates have been smoothed over. When Ida invented herself, when she became Ida Mayfield, she had to decide what to do about Mary. The simplest thing would have been to leave her behind, the way she had left her parents and her brothers behind. The simplest thing would have been to walk out of the Walsh family entirely and never return. And in many ways, this is what she did. She did not maintain ties with her parents. She did not write to them. She did not invite them to her house. They were, for all the practical purposes of her new life, dead to her. But Mary was different. Mary, for reasons we cannot fully reconstruct, came to live with Ida. Perhaps Mary had nowhere else to go. Perhaps Ida felt some obligation, some old love that survived all her careful suppressions. Perhaps Mary was useful in some way Ida valued. Whatever the reason, Mary moved into Ida's household, and she stayed there, and she stayed there, and she stayed there. She would, in the end, stay there for the rest of her life. But she stayed there as a different kind of relation than she actually was. She did not stay as Ida's sister. To have introduced her as a sister would have been to begin a story that led, by inevitable degrees, to questions about where the sisters had come from, about the family, about the parents, about the country and the city and the boats. It would have been to crack the carefully sealed surface of Ida's invented life. So Ida introduced Mary as her sister, but in a way that fitted the invention. Mary became Mary Mayfield. She became, in the official story, Ida's sister from the Louisiana plantation. She had the same imaginary father. She had the same imaginary upbringing. She moved through New York society, when she moved through it at all, as Miss Mary Mayfield, a Southern lady who lived with her sister Mrs. Wood. Mary was, by every account that survives, a quiet and reclusive person. Whether by temperament or by training or by both, she did not seek attention. She did not make herself prominent in society. She did not marry. She did not, in fact, seem to have any relationships outside the household at all. She lived with Ida. She accepted whatever role Ida assigned her. She existed in the world almost exclusively as an extension of her sister. This is one of the strange and quiet tragedies of the story. Mary had her own life to live. She had her own thoughts, her own preferences, her own loves and disappointments. We can imagine that she did. All people do. But the record of those thoughts and preferences has been almost entirely obliterated, because she lived in the shadow of her sister's invention, and the invention required that nothing about Mary be too clearly defined. To have defined Mary too clearly would have been to risk contradicting the story. So Mary remained vague. She remained quiet. She moved through the household like a piece of furniture, valued, present, essential to the room, but rarely commented upon. The few photographs that exist of her show a thin woman with the same dark colouring as her sister, but without the sister's command, without the sister's gaze. She looks, in the photographs, like someone who has been told to stand still for the camera and has dutifully done so. There is nothing of herself in the picture. She's occupying the frame. Emma was different. Emma was Ida's daughter, and the relationship between them was, by all the indirect evidence, a complicated one. Ida loved Emma. She also, in a deeper way, controlled Emma. Emma had been raised in the household where Ida was the central planet around which everything else orbited. The gravity of that planet was strong. Emma did not develop, in the way other young women of her class developed, an independent set of interests, an independent set of friends, an independent path. She remained close to her mother, she remained inside the orbit. This is more notable than it sounds. Young women of the period, in households of means, often chafed at maternal control. They sought freedom in the small ways that were available. They pressed for marriages of their own choosing. They went out. They had circles. Emma did not particularly do any of these things. She stayed at home. She helped manage the household. She accompanied her mother to social events, when there were social events to attend. She was, in the household photograph that we can mentally construct, always slightly to one side and slightly behind her mother, in the position of an attendant rather than a separate person. There are several possible explanations. Emma may have been temperamentally disinclined toward independence. Some children are, even when their mothers are easier than Ida. Or Emma may have been actively, quietly, prevented from developing independence. Ida, who had constructed her own life through enormous force of will, would not necessarily have wanted her daughter to do the same. A daughter with too much will of her own might leave. A daughter with too much will of her own might marry the wrong person, might say the wrong thing, might, in some unguarded moment, ask the wrong question about the family's history. Better, perhaps, to keep her close, better to keep her dependent, better to keep her, in the end, at home. There were no marriages for Emma. There were no children. There were no separate establishments. As the years passed, as Emma moved through her 20s and into her 30s and beyond, the possibility of her having a life of her own faded gradually away. She became, like Mary, an extension of Ida. She became one of the 3 women in the household, 3 women who lived together, ate together, slept under the same roof, and showed the world a single coordinated face that was, beneath all its appearances, the face of Ida Mayfield Wood. Benjamin Wood, the husband and father, died in 1890. He was 69 years old. He had been a presence in Ida's life for nearly 4 decades, since that first letter, and the first meeting, and the first careful arrangement of the second household. He had been, by all the available evidence, a husband who was kind to her, who provided for her, who admired her, who never, as far as we know, pressed too hard on the questions about her past that could not have been answered honestly. He left her his estate. The estate was substantial, though not as substantial as it might have been. Benjamin had been a gambler. He had been in his later years a gambler whose luck was less reliable than it had been earlier. The investments had gone up and down. The wins and losses had cancelled each other out more often as the years went on. The estate that came to Ida was perhaps in the range of $500,000, give or take, in the dollars of 1890. But Ida had been gathering. For nearly 4 decades she had been taking her half of every win and putting it aside. She had been managing it carefully. She had been adding to it whenever she could. By the time Benjamin died, the money she had gathered for herself, the money that was hers and not part of his official estate, was substantial. It was, perhaps, as much again as the estate itself. Perhaps more. She was, in the year 1890, a wealthy widow. She was 52 years old by some calculations. She was, by other calculations she had carefully encouraged, somewhat younger. She had a daughter who was unmarried, and a sister who was quietly reclusive, and she had a great deal of money, and she had, finally, no husband to consider, no household to entertain, no public position to maintain. She could, at this point, have done many things. She could have continued to live in the Wood family's New York mansion, hosting dinners, maintaining her position in society, growing slowly older as society women of her station grew slowly older. She could have travelled. Many widows of her means travelled in those years, taking long European tours, wintering in Italy, summering in Switzerland. She could have invested actively in the stock market and the real estate market, which, despite her late husband's mixed record, were producing fortunes for the careful investors of the period. She could have written memoirs. She could have engaged in philanthropy, the way many wealthy widows engaged in philanthropy, attaching her husband's name to charitable foundations that would carry it forward into the next century. She did not do any of these things. What she did instead, slowly at first and then with increasing decisiveness, was withdraw. She gave up the Wood mansion. She moved to smaller quarters. She declined invitations. She stopped giving dinners. She let the servants go one by one, except for the ones she absolutely needed. She narrowed her social world to almost nothing. the people who had come to her parties stopped seeing her. The names of Mrs. Benjamin Wood and her sister Miss Mayfield disappeared from the society columns. The columns moved on, as they always did, to other names, other houses, other carefully observed performances of wealth and status. The retreat was gradual. It took years. By the late 1890s, by the turn of the 20th century, by the early years of 1900 and the first decade that followed, Ida Mayfield Wood and her daughter and her sister were living in increasingly modest accommodations in Manhattan, increasingly invisible to the world they had once inhabited, increasingly silent. It was as if some long internal calculation had finally arrived at its conclusion. The performance of the wealthy widow had been completed. The role had been played to its proper end. There was nothing left now to perform for. The audience had dispersed. The lights had been brought down. And Ida, the woman who had built her whole life around being seen as a particular kind of person, was choosing to be seen, finally, as no kind of person at all. She was choosing to disappear. Why she chose this, we cannot fully know. There may have been many reasons. There may have been growing fear about money, about the safety of money, about what could happen to a wealthy widow in a city of strangers. There may have been the slow, accumulating fatigue of a performance maintained for 40 years. There may have been the desire, finally, to rest. There may have been the simple wish to live the rest of her life on her own terms, in her own rooms, without having to greet anyone or charm anyone or maintain any face at all. There is more to say, before we move on, about the household in those last years before the Great Withdrawal. The household that had once been bustling, with servants and visitors, and the regular small pulse of social life, became, by stages, something quieter and stranger. The first thing to go was the entertaining. Ida simply stopped issuing invitations. The dinners that had marked her social calendar, the small lunches with other ladies of her circle, the afternoon teas in the parlour with its silver service, all of it ceased. Friends who had been accustomed to coming to the Woodhouse no longer received the small notes that summoned them. The drawing room, which had been the centre of the household's social life, fell into a kind of disuse. The carpets in it were rolled up and stored, the good china was packed away, the silver was wrapped in flannel and put in the safe. Then the staff began to leave. The cook, who had been with the household for many years, was let go gently, with a small pension and a recommendation. There was no longer enough work to justify her position. The kitchen would still need to function, but on a much smaller scale. A simpler woman, a maid-of-all-work, was kept on for a while to handle the basic tasks. The footmen, of whom there had been 2 in the busy years, were dismissed. The housemaid who had managed the cleaning was reduced to part-time. The coachman who had driven the wood carriage for so many years was let go when the carriage itself was sold. By the early 1900s, the household had only 1 or 2 servants, where it had once had 8 or 10. Then the house itself was given up. The mansion the Woods had occupied during the prosperous years was too large for what the household had become. It was sold. Ida moved to smaller quarters, an apartment somewhere in Manhattan, the exact location of which has been imperfectly preserved. The apartment was respectable but not grand. It was the residence of a wealthy widow who had given up the pretensions of public life, but who still lived comfortably. Ida and Mary and Emma moved in. The apartment had perhaps 4 or 5 rooms. It was sufficient, easily sufficient for 3 women who had simplified their lives. But even the apartment, after a few years, became more than Ida wanted. The maintenance of an apartment required the management of small ongoing affairs. There were repairs to be arranged. There were neighbours to be acknowledged. There was the small social presence required even of a private household, the deliveries that had to be received, the bills that had to be paid, the various small ways in which an apartment connects its residents to the world. Ida wanted less of that. She wanted, in a way that began to clarify itself in those years, almost none of it. She wanted to live, finally, in a place where the management of daily life would be done by other people, where the connections to the outside world would be minimized, where she could simply close a door and be left alone. A hotel suite in those years was an attractive option for elderly women of means who had reached this point in their lives. The hotel handled the management. The hotel cleaned when allowed to clean. The hotel provided meals when meals were ordered. The hotel handled the maintenance, the repairs, the small daily affairs of building management. The residents simply paid the bill, and otherwise existed within the hotel's protective shell. Ida moved to the Herald Square Hotel sometime around 1907. She brought Mary. She brought Emma. She brought eventually the cash from the bank. She brought what furniture and personal effects she wanted to keep, and the rest was sold or given away or simply left behind. The transition was a kind of definitive choice. The mansion had been sold years before. The apartment had been given up. Now even the apartment's connections to the world were dispensed with. The hotel was an enclosure within an enclosure, a private suite within a public building, a small fortress of paid-for solitude in the middle of the largest city in America. Mary, when the move occurred, was somewhere in her 60s. She had spent her entire adult life inside her sister's household. She had no resources of her own, no independent identity, no reason to do anything other than what Ida wanted. So she moved when Ida moved. She accepted the suite when Ida chose the suite. She entered the closed door when the closed door began to close, and she did not protest. There is no record of her protesting. There is no record of her arguing. She simply went where she was told to go, the way she had always gone where she was told to go, the way she had been bound to go since the long-ago decision to leave the Walsh family behind and to live, instead, in the careful invented world of her sister's making. Emma was somewhere in her late 40s or early 50s. She too had no independent path. The marriage that had never happened was now too unlikely to consider. The career that had not been encouraged was now impossible to begin. The friends she had not been allowed to develop into deep friendships were not the kind of friends who would now help her break away from her mother. Emma went where Ida went. Emma sat where Ida sat. Emma had become, by then, what she would always be, the daughter who had stayed. Whether this caused her sorrow, we cannot know. Emma left no diary. She left no letters that have survived. She left no record of what she felt about the long, quiet life her mother had constructed for her. She may have been content. She may have been deeply unhappy. She may have been simply, in the way of many quiet people, neither one nor the other, simply continuing, simply existing, simply moving through the days that had been arranged for her. The three women then, in 1907, in the suite at the Herald Square Hotel. Three women whose ages added together came to something like 200 years of human life. Three women bound together by family, by long habit, by the strange shared project of pretending to be people they were not. Three women now closing a door behind them. The closing of the door was not for any of them a tragedy. It may have been, in fact, a relief. The performances they had all been conducting could now ease. The masks could come down, or could at least be relaxed. Inside the closed door, no one was watching. Inside the closed door, the three of them could simply be, with each other, without having to be anyone in particular for anyone outside. Whatever the reasons, the retreat continued. The world outside grew dimmer. The rooms in which Ida lived grew smaller, and in 1907, after one final and decisive transaction, she would close a door behind her, and she would not open it again voluntarily for more than 2 decades. It is worth pausing before we move into the great event of 1907 to consider what was being given up. The retreat was not just a retreat from social life. It was a retreat from a great many specific things, and each of those things had its own particular texture and weight, and the giving up of each of them was its own small loss. There was the giving up of the seasons, not the seasons as they passed through the rooms, but the seasons as one met them outside. The cold, cheek-stinging air of a January walk, the first warm afternoon in April, when the parks fill with people in lighter coats, the thick green humidity of August in the city, the blue clean afternoons of October. Ida had walked through all these seasons in her younger years, in the parks and on the avenues and along the docks and through the small squares of Manhattan. She had felt the weather on her face. She had smelled the changes in the air. After the door closed, all of this would come to her only in newspaper descriptions, or through the window in muted form. The direct experience of the seasons was over. Her body would not feel them again, not in their full, unmediated quality, for as long as she lived. There was the giving up of the city itself. New York, the city she had studied and learned and finally conquered, would no longer be available to her except in the abstract. She would not walk down Fifth Avenue. She would not see the new buildings as they were built. She would not stand on the Brooklyn Bridge and watch the boats in the East River. She would not visit the parks. She would not attend the opera. She would not enter the new museums and libraries that her own generation had endowed. The city she had given so much of her life to becoming a part of would now go on, all around her, without her physical participation. There was the giving up of food. The food in the suite was by deliberate choice austere. The simple fish and the dry crackers and the weak tea. Ida would not eat again the elaborate meals of her social years. She would not have oysters and champagne. She would not have rich roasts and complicated sauces. She would not perhaps ever again taste a fresh ripe peach or a properly prepared lamb chop or a slice of well-aged cheese. The pleasures of the table, which had been substantial in her younger years, were over. She had decided, perhaps without quite naming the decision, that food was simply fuel, and that fuel could be cheap and simple, and that the resources thus saved could be added to the great pile she was preserving for reasons she may not have fully articulated even to herself. There was the giving up of clothing. The closets in the suite would, in the years that followed, hold dresses that grew steadily older and more worn. There would be no new gowns. There would be no trips to the dressmaker. There would be no fittings, no consultations about the latest fashions, no excited unwrapping of new garments from their tissue paper. The whole long pleasure of dressing well, which had been one of the central arts of her social years, was simply finished. She would wear what she had until it fell apart, and then she would wear something older, and then something older still, until at the end she was wearing the dim, faded outline of clothes that had once, decades before, been beautiful. There was the giving up of new acquaintance. Ida would not, after the door closed, meet anyone new, not in any meaningful sense. There would be the porter who brought up the newspapers. There would be the occasional clerk who handled some small matter of business. But the introductions to interesting people, the development of new friendships, the slow building of new connections that ordinarily continues in some form throughout a long life, would simply stop. The social world she had constructed over decades had already shrunk to almost nothing. After the door closed, it would shrink to nothing at all. Her circle would consist of her sister and her daughter, and that would be the entire circle for the rest of her life. These were the things being given up. They were considerable things. They were the substance of much of what most people consider the goods of a long life. Ida gave them up, perhaps without quite naming what she was doing, in exchange for something else. The something else was the security of a sealed life, the impossibility of further exposure, the deep quiet of a closed door. Whether the trade was worth it is a question that everyone who reads her story has to answer for themselves. Ida, by all available evidence, had answered it for herself, long before 1907, and the answer was yes. But before that door closed, before the long retreat concluded in its final sealed silence, there was one moment of decision, one choice, one walk to a bank on a particular day, with a particular plan in mind. That walk is the next chapter of the story. The day was in the spring of 1907. The exact date is not recorded with certainty, but the year was a year when the city was alive with a particular kind of nervousness. The panic of 1907 was building slowly at first and then with accelerating speed. Banks were under pressure, stocks were unsteady. The financial pages of the newspapers were full of small alarms, the kind of alarms that careful readers learned to take seriously, and that incautious readers learned eventually to wish they had taken seriously. Ida read the newspapers. She had always read the newspapers. She read them with the particular attention of a woman who had been gathering money for half a century and who did not intend to lose it now. She read the financial pages. She read the small notices about bank reserves and call money rates and the troubles of trust companies. She read, and she calculated, and she came to a decision. She was going to walk to her bank, and she was going to take her money out. Not some of it, not most of it, all of it. Every cent that she had on deposit, every share that the bank held for her, every note, every certificate, every line on the ledger that recorded the holdings of Mrs. Ida Mayfield Wood. She was going to convert it all to cash, and she was going to walk out of the bank with the cash, and she was going to take it home and put it in places that only she knew about. The amount was not small. The amount was, in fact, staggering. It was somewhere in the neighbourhood of $1 million. To understand what $1 million meant in 1907, we have to do the arithmetic of an earlier age. A working man in those years, a clerk or a tradesman, or a moderately skilled labourer, might earn between $500 and $1,000 in a year. A schoolteacher might earn $600. A factory worker might earn $400. $1 million, then, was the equivalent of 1,000 or 2,000 annual salaries of the people who walked past her on the street. In modern terms, after a century of inflation, it was the equivalent of something like $30 or $40 million. It was an enormous fortune. It was the kind of fortune that an entire family of moderate means might never see, even if every member of every generation worked hard for the rest of their lives. And Ida was going to put it in a cab and take it home. The walk to the bank that morning would have taken her through the streets of a city in spring. The trees in the small squares would have been just beginning to leaf out, the pale, fresh green that Manhattan trees show before the deeper summer green sets in. The air would have smelled of horses and coal smoke, as it always did, but with a faint underlying sweetness from the trees and from the patches of grass in the parks. The sun would have been mild. The shadows on the buildings would have been sharp. Ida was 69 years old by the most generous calculation. She was probably older. She would have been dressed that morning in the clothes of a respectable widow of the period. A dark dress, perhaps, in some quiet colour, a hat, properly placed, gloves, a small handbag. She would have walked with the careful, slightly slow pace of an older woman who's been on her feet a long time and has learned to manage the energy of a long day. She arrived at the bank. The bank was a substantial institution in Lower Manhattan, the kind of institution that occupied a building of carved stone with heavy doors and interior columns and the soft, echoing acoustics of a great public space. She would have walked across the marble floor. She would have approached the appropriate desk. She would have asked in her quiet voice to see a particular officer. The officer would have come. He knew her. He had handled her account, or his predecessors had handled it for years. Mrs. Wood was an old client. Mrs. Wood was a substantial client. The bank was very pleased to have her. She told him what she wanted. There is no transcript. There is no perfectly preserved account of the conversation that followed, but we can reconstruct from what is known the shape of it. The officer would have been startled. He would have tried gently to dissuade her. Mrs. Wood, he would have said, the markets are unsettled, but the bank is sound. The bank has weathered worse. The bank is, in fact, taking precautions. Your funds are entirely safe. There is no need for any drastic action. Ida would have listened. She would have nodded, perhaps. She would have heard him out with the patience of a woman who has heard many men say many things over many years. And then she would have repeated her request. She would like to withdraw her funds, all of her funds, in cash. The officer would have escalated the matter. He would have brought in his superior. The superior would have come. Mrs. Wood, the superior, would have said with greater urgency now, "This is a substantial sum. This is indeed a most substantial sum. We cannot, in good conscience, simply hand you this amount in cash. The dangers are considerable. The bank, you must understand, has obligations. The bank has its own concerns about the optics of so large a withdrawal at so sensitive a moment." This is the moment when Ida did the thing for which she would, in the small circle of bank officers who knew about it, become quietly legendary. She told them calmly that if they did not give her money, she would tell everyone she knew that the bank was insolvent. She would say to anyone who asked, and to many people who did not ask, that the bank was failing, that her own savings had been impossible to retrieve, that any depositor with funds in the bank had better remove those funds immediately. She would, in short, start a run on the bank. The threat was devastating. It was devastating because it would almost certainly work. Bank runs in 1907 were not a hypothetical. They were happening, that very week, that very month. A wealthy widow telling her social circle that her bank had refused her own money would generate exactly the kind of panic that could topple a financial institution in a matter of days. The bank's officers understood this. They understood it perfectly. They looked at the small, dark-eyed woman in front of them, and they recalculated. The arrangements were made. The money was assembled. It would have taken time. The officers would have brought up cash from the vault in stages, in the various denominations that Ida specified. There would have been counting. There would have been more counting by different officers for verification. There would have been ledger entries, signature confirmations, small bureaucratic ceremonies that the bank performed in order to satisfy itself that the transaction had been recorded properly. While all this was happening, Ida sat in the bank. She would have been given a chair in some quiet office, away from the public lobby, and she would have waited. The waiting would have taken hours. The bank, like all banks of the period, conducted its physical operations slowly. Cash had to be brought up from the vault by men with keys, and the vault was protected by elaborate procedures that did not allow for quick withdrawals. The counting was done by hand, with each bill examined individually for authenticity, with the totals tallied on small slips of paper, with the slips themselves then collated and tallied again to produce the final master tally that would be entered into the ledger. Ida would have watched some of this perhaps from her chair. She would have watched the officers come and go with their heavy ledger books and their small bundles of bills. She would have heard the muffled sounds of the bank's other business going on around her, the customers in the lobby beyond, the click of typewriters in some other office, the soft footsteps of clerks on the marble floors. The smell of the bank would have been the smell of all banks of that period, a smell of paper and ink and leather and the faint metallic suggestion of coins. The light would have been the soft electric light of a building where electricity was by then a settled feature. The chair she sat in would have been some heavy piece of bank furniture, upholstered in dark leather with brass studs around the edge of the seat. She would have felt, perhaps, a kind of slow, steady satisfaction during those hours of waiting. Decades of preparation were coming to their fruition. The cash she had been gathering since the early years of her marriage was being released finally into her direct physical custody. The intermediaries were being eliminated. The structure she had been moving toward in some part of her mind, since she was a small girl in Boston, was being assembled at last. Whatever else the day was, it was a day of arrival. She had been heading toward it for a very long time. The officers came back eventually with the final tallies. The total was confirmed, the signatures were collected, the ledger entries were made, the whole long, slow process reached at last its end. And then, at last, the money would have been packed. It is unclear exactly how the money was packed. There are some accounts that suggest it was placed in a kind of large bundle or sack. There are others that suggest it was distributed across several smaller containers. Perhaps it was both. The total physical bulk of $1 million in cash, in the bills of the period, was not negligible. It was a large quantity. It was the kind of quantity that requires planning, that requires more than one container, that requires, perhaps, more than one trip to a waiting vehicle. The vehicle was a cab, a horse-drawn cab in those years. The cab waited at the door of the bank. Ida, with her bundles and a small entourage of bank employees, who had been pressed into helping her, came down the steps and approached the cab. The bundles were loaded. Ida climbed in. The cab driver, who may or may not have understood what he was carrying, clucked to his horse and started down the street. And so, on a spring morning in 1907, Ida Mayfield Wood drove home from her bank in a horse-drawn cab with $1 million in cash piled around her, while the city went about its business, and the trees in the squares put out their tender new leaves, and the sun moved across the sky toward the middle of the afternoon. The cab took her, eventually, to her destination. The destination was the Herald Square Hotel. The Herald Square Hotel was a large building on the corner of Broadway and 34th Street, in the area of the city known as Herald Square. It was a respectable hotel, not the most fashionable in the city, but a perfectly proper place for a widow of means to take rooms. Ida had taken rooms there. She had taken a suite on the 5th floor, a suite consisting of 2 rooms with a connecting door. One room would be for her, the other would be for Mary and Emma. The rooms had windows looking out over the city. They had the hotel's standard furnishings, the heavy dark furniture, and the patterned carpets, and the gas fixtures that were, in 1907, just beginning to be supplemented by electrical ones. The cab arrived at the hotel. The bundles were unloaded, they were brought up with discretion and with effort to the 5th floor. They were carried into the suite. The door of the suite was closed. It is worth pausing on the small physical facts of that first afternoon. The hotel staff who carried the bundles up did not know what they were carrying. They knew only that the elderly Mrs. Wood had returned from an errand with a quantity of parcels, and that the parcels were to be brought to her rooms. The staff was discreet, in the way that hotel staff in respectable houses had learned to be discreet. They asked no questions. They did their work. They accepted whatever small gratuity Ida pressed into their hands. They withdrew. Inside the suite, the bundles were placed on the floor and on the beds and on the chairs. Mary stood somewhere in the room watching. Emma, whose understanding of what was happening was probably not complete, stood somewhere else. The room was full of money in a way that no ordinary room is ever full of money. Money was on every surface. Money was in every container. Money was, in a literal sense, the new furniture of the suite, occupying space that ordinary domestic life would have allotted to ordinary domestic things. And then Ida went around the room and she began to put the money away. She had thought about this. It is clear from what is known of her later behaviour that she had thought about this carefully. She did not simply pile the money in a corner, she distributed it. She placed bundles in the drawers of the bureau. She placed bundles inside other containers, which she placed inside other containers. She tucked bills into the linings of garments she had no intention of wearing again. She placed bundles between the pages of books and between the layers of papers and inside the recesses of furniture that had been built in the way furniture of that period was built, with hidden interiors and small unsuspected cavities. The hiding took time. It took perhaps several days. Mary may have helped, or Mary may have stood by, watching, accepting, allowing her mother to do as her mother wished. Emma was probably not enlisted. Whatever the precise division of labour, the work was eventually done. The money was distributed throughout the suite, in dozens of small caches, in such a way that no thief who broke in could easily find it all, and no fire that started in one room could easily destroy it all, and no disaster that befell any one container could destroy the whole. It was, in its way, an act of considerable competence. It was the act of a woman who had been thinking for a long time about how to keep what she had. It was not the act of a woman who had panicked. It was the act of a woman who had made a plan, and who was now carrying out the plan, with the calm thoroughness of someone who had been waiting, perhaps for years, for the right moment to begin. And then, when the work was done, she sat down, and she stayed. That was more or less the moment when the door closed. It would not be opened again, voluntarily by Ida for the rest of her life. We must pause and consider this. Ida was, at this moment, somewhere around 69 or 70 years old. She had a daughter who was around 50. She had a sister who was somewhere in her 60s. The three women were now, all together, in a suite at the Herald Square Hotel with $1 million in cash piled around them, and they were going to stay there. How long they intended to stay at first is unknown. Perhaps Ida thought she would stay for a few weeks, until the financial panic passed. Perhaps she thought a few months. Perhaps she had already decided in some deep part of herself that she was never coming out. We can imagine, with some patience, the first night in the suite. The work of hiding had not yet been completed. There were bundles still on the chairs and on the beds and on the small table by the window. The light coming in through the window was the soft golden light of a spring evening in lower Manhattan, falling across the patterned carpet, falling across the heavy dark furniture, falling across the small drift of bills that lay on the bureau. Ida would have been tired. The day had been a long day. The journey to the bank, the long hours of waiting while the money was assembled, the journey home, the slow, careful unloading of the bundles, all of it had taken its toll on a woman of nearly 70. She would have sat down at some point in the chair that would become, over the years, her chair. The chair was a sturdy upholstered thing, with arms wide enough to rest a teacup on. She would have sunk into it. She would have looked, perhaps, at the bundles around her. She would have felt, perhaps, the deep settled satisfaction of a person who has reached the end of a long journey and arrived in the place she'd been moving toward for years. Mary, somewhere in the suite, was perhaps preparing tea on the small hot plate. Emma, somewhere else in the suite, was perhaps unpacking a small valise, or sitting quietly in another chair, or simply standing at the window looking out at the city she had agreed, without quite agreeing, to leave behind. The three of them moved through the rooms with the small, quiet movements of people who have been in each other's company for so long that words are not necessary. Whatever needed to be said had been said. Whatever needed to be decided had been decided. The decision, large and irreversible, had been carried out. The light outside the window gradually faded. The lamps in the suite were lit one by one. The shadows in the corners deepened. The sounds of the city continued, of course, just outside, the carriages and the streetcars and the soft rumble of human activity, but the sounds were now, somehow, on the other side of a transparent wall. The three women were inside the wall. The world was outside it. The wall would not, for any of the three, be crossed again in either direction for many years to come. Ida, in her chair, would eventually have stood up. She would have moved slowly to her bed. She would have lain down. She would have closed her eyes. The first night in the suite would have ended in the way all nights end, with sleep, with breath, with the small, quiet body of a woman finally letting go of a day that had been, in its slow, careful way, the most decisive day of her long life. The financial panic, as it happened, did pass. The panic of 1907 lasted for several months, generated several spectacular bank failures, prompted a series of dramatic interventions by the financier J.P. Morgan, who personally orchestrated rescues of several institutions, and finally subsided into the slow recovery of the broader American economy. By the spring of 1908, most of the worst was over. The banks that had survived continued to operate. The banks that had failed and been forgotten. Life, for most New Yorkers, returned to whatever shape it had had before. But Ida did not come out. The panic passed, and she did not come out. The years passed, one and another, and she did not come out. The suite at the Herald Square Hotel became, by stages, the only world she knew. She had withdrawn from society some years before. Now she had withdrawn from the city itself. The city continued all around her, the great noisy business of New York. The streetcars ran on Broadway, the pedestrians walked by below, the newspapers were sold on the corner. The whole vast living organism of the city went about its life, while 5 floors above, in 2 darkened rooms, 3 women settled into a stillness that would deepen year by year into something approaching the stillness of a tomb. The door was closed. Ida had built her own ending. The ending would last, in the form she had chosen for it, for more than 2 decades. It is worth describing the rooms, because the rooms became, in the end, the entire physical world of 3 human beings, and the physical world of 3 human beings is not a small thing, however small the world becomes. The suite was on the 5th floor. The 5th floor was, in 1907, a quiet floor. It was high enough above the street that the noise of carriages and streetcars came up muted, dulled by distance, like the sound of a faraway river. It was low enough that, on a sunny day, the light from the windows could still warm the rooms in the morning hours. The windows looked out on one side toward Broadway. On the other side, they looked toward an interior air shaft, a narrow space between buildings that admitted only a faint indirect light. There were 2 rooms. The arrangement was a simple one, common in residential hotels of the period. There was a sitting room which contained a sofa, several upholstered chairs, a small table, and various lamps and side pieces. The walls were papered in a pattern that, like all hotel patterns, had been chosen for its inoffensiveness rather than for its beauty. There was a fireplace, which may or may not have been functional by that point. There was a window with curtains. There was a door that led out into the hotel hallway, and another door that led into the bedroom. The bedroom was the smaller of the 2 rooms. It contained beds. The exact number is uncertain, but there were enough beds for the 3 women. There was a wardrobe, there was a small dresser, there was another window with another set of curtains. There was a door to a small private bathroom, which by the standards of the period was a luxury, the kind of thing one expected at a respectable hotel and did not always find. These were the 2 rooms. This was the suite. From 1907 onward, this was the world. In the first months and years, the rooms had things in them that would have looked, to a visitor, like the normal things in a hotel suite. The furniture was where the hotel had placed it. The lamps were lit when needed. The beds were made each morning by the chambermaid. The windows were occasionally opened to admit fresh air. The rooms were occasionally cleaned. But the rooms were also, from the very beginning, full of money. The money was distributed in many places. Some of it was in the standard hiding places that wealthy people of the period favoured, drawers and chests and the deep recesses of closets. Some of it was in less standard places. Some of it was in cracker tins, the small tin boxes that store-bought crackers came in, which were used by many households to hold small valuables and which Ida had begun to use as a kind of informal banking system. The crackers themselves had been eaten or thrown away. The tins remained, refilled with rolls of bills. Some of the money was in shoeboxes stacked beneath the bed. Some of it was sewn into the linings of clothes, in the manner of immigrants who had brought across the ocean with them the old habit of carrying valuables on the body. Some of it was rolled into the cores of newspapers, which were then folded and stacked along walls. Some of it was wedged into the corners of the wardrobe. Some of it was inside the folds of curtains. Some of it was, eventually, simply piled in heaps on furniture, on tables, on the seats of unused chairs, because there was, in the end, more money than there were good places to hide it. The money was the dominant feature of the rooms. It was everywhere. It was a fact that simply had to be lived with, like the wallpaper or the windows. And around the money, the three women began their long, slow, unrelenting routine. They got up in the mornings, presumably. They dressed more or less. The dressing became, over the years, less and less complete. Ida, in her younger days the most carefully turned-out woman in any room, slowly let her standards slip. The dresses she wore became older. They were not replaced. The lace collars that had been white when they were new became grey, and then yellowed, and then, in the way of old fabric, began to fall apart at the edges. The dresses themselves, the heavy fabrics of the early 1900s, gradually wore through at the elbows and at the hems. They were not mended, or were mended only crudely. They were certainly not replaced. Mary and Emma wore similar things. The household had, at the moment of withdrawal, a stock of clothing appropriate to a wealthy widow's household. 3 women with 1 wardrobe each, plus various spare garments for different occasions. That stock had to last. It did in fact last. It lasted for 2 decades because no new clothes were brought in. Food was brought in. The hotel had a kitchen, and the hotel could send food up. In the early years, Ida sometimes ordered meals from the hotel kitchen. They were brought up by a porter. They were left in the hall or, when she was willing, brought into the sitting room and placed on the table. The empty dishes were left in the hall again, eventually to be collected. But Ida grew suspicious of the hotel food. She grew suspicious of the kitchen, of the cooks, of the possibility that something might be added to her food that she did not want added. She had read, perhaps, accounts of poisonings. She had heard stories. She had developed, over the long years of accumulating money, the kind of suspiciousness that often accompanies large unspent fortunes. She began to refuse most of the meals from the hotel. What she ate, instead, in the later years, became one of the most peculiar features of the whole arrangement. She subsisted for very long stretches of her life in the rooms on a diet of remarkable simplicity and oddness. She ate fish. She ate it, sometimes, raw or barely cooked, prepared in a small pan on a hot plate she had set up in the suite. She ate crackers, the kind that came in the tins that she now used for money. She ate condensed milk, the thick, sweet substance in cans that she had a porter bring up. She ate eggs, occasionally. She drank weak tea. That was more or less the menu. Year after year, decade after decade, fish and crackers and condensed milk and eggs and tea. The 3 women lived on this. They did not get scurvy, somehow, though they did not eat much fruit. They did not waste away, though they grew thin and frail. They simply went on day after day eating the same small repertoire of foods in a room piled with money behind a door that did not open. They also barely left the suite. There were occasional small forays. Sometimes one of them would go out for some specific errand. But these grew rarer over time, and eventually they nearly stopped altogether. Ida came to prefer that no one go out at all. She came to prefer that the door stay closed. She came to prefer that the world stay outside. The suite grew dirty. This was inevitable. With the chambermaid not allowed in, with no servants to clean, with 3 older women who had less and less energy to clean for themselves, the dust accumulated. The dust accumulated on the furniture, in the corners, along the baseboards. It accumulated eventually in great soft drifts that would have shocked any visitor. The bedclothes were not changed. The towels were not laundered. The bathroom, that small luxury, became a place that was less and less pleasant to enter. The smells of the rooms changed over the years. They were never quite fresh again. But Ida did not seem to notice. Or if she did notice, she did not care. The rooms were not for showing. The rooms were not for entertaining. The rooms were a fortress. Inside the fortress, the appearance of things did not matter. What mattered was the security of the money. What mattered was the absence of intruders. What mattered was the closed door. She had, even in the rooms, her routines. She read newspapers. She had them brought up. She read them carefully, particularly the financial pages. She kept track of the markets, even from her sealed-off perch above 34th Street. She knew when stocks went up and when they went down. She knew which banks were prospering and which were failing. She had a precise and lucid mind, even in those last years, even in the rooms full of dust and old paper, and she used that mind daily to monitor the world she had withdrawn from. She also kept her own accounts. She had a number of small notebooks. She wrote in them in her careful sloping hand, the same hand that had once written the letter to Benjamin Wood. She recorded what came in and what went out. She tracked, with painstaking detail, every small expense. The few bills that the hotel sent up, the cost of the food the porter brought, the few personal items that occasionally had to be replaced, every cent was recorded, every cent was accounted for. She paid the hotel bills. This is important. She paid the hotel bills with the most rigorous regularity. The bill came each month, and each month Ada paid it in cash, slipping the envelope under the door or having Mary or Emma slide it out to a waiting clerk. The bill was paid in full, on time, every month, for more than 20 years. The hotel, therefore, had no reason to disturb her. Ida had understood at some deep level that money paid on time creates a kind of peace, a kind of automatic non-interference. As long as the hotel was paid, the hotel would not press, and the hotel was paid. So the rooms, for all their strangeness, were stable. They were a world. They had their rhythms. The morning came, and the afternoon, and the evening, and the night, and the next morning. The newspapers arrived, and were read, and were stacked in piles. The food came up and was eaten, and the dishes were left in the hall. The money sat in its tins and its boxes and its drifts, in places that only Ida fully knew. The dust accumulated, the clothes wore out. The hair of 3 older women turned increasingly grey and then white. The faces of 3 older women, looking at each other day after day in the dim light of 2 rooms, became the faces of women who had lived together so long that they no longer needed many words. Mary, who had always been quiet, became almost silent. She moved through the rooms when she moved like a ghost. She had her own bed. She had her own corner. She had perhaps her own thoughts, though she did not often share them. She was Ida's sister. She had been Ida's sister since the rooms in Boston and the boats and the streets where the children played. She would be Ida's sister at the end. There was nothing else by then for her to be. Emma, who had been Ida's daughter and had also, in the long quiet way of the household, been Ida's project, accepted the rooms with the same quiet acceptance that had marked her whole life. She did not protest. She did not ask to leave. She did, in those rooms, what she had always done in any room her mother put her in. She stayed. And Ida, at the centre, the maker of the arrangement, the planner who had walked out of the bank with $1 million in cash and had brought it home and put it round her in piles and tins and shoeboxes, sat in her chair and read her newspapers and wrote in her little notebooks and watched, day by day, the slow turning of years that she had arranged to spend in this exact place. The years turned, the rooms aged, the 3 women aged with them, and outside, beyond the closed door, beyond the heavy curtains, the world went on changing. It is worth pausing here, in the long stillness of the rooms, to consider what a single day in that household might have looked like, in some middle year of the long retreat, perhaps 1915 or 1918, somewhere in the long undifferentiated middle of the 22 years. The day would have begun with light. The light came through the heavy curtains at the window facing Broadway, a narrow strip of light that crept slowly across the carpet as the sun climbed. Ida, who had always been an early riser, would have woken first. She would have lain still for a while in her bed, listening. The hotel had its own sounds, which she had come to know intimately. There were footsteps in the hallway sometimes, the soft tread of a chambermaid going about her early rounds. There was the distant clatter of breakfast trays being assembled in some kitchen below. There was the city outside beginning its day. She would have risen. She would have moved in the slow way of the elderly to the small basin where she washed her face in cold water. She would have brushed her hair, which had gone fully white by now, hair so long it fell well past her waist when it was loose, hair she'd worn the same way for 60 years and saw no reason to change. She would have pinned it up, in some loose old-fashioned arrangement that no one but Mary and Emma would see anyway. She would have dressed in whatever dress she happened to be wearing that month. The dresses had become, by this point in the retreat, almost archaeological objects. They had been new in 1900 or 1905. They had been worn with rotation ever since. The fabric had begun in places to thin and fray. The colours had faded in places where light could reach them, retained their original tone in places where light could not. There were small mendings here and there, the careful stitches of a woman who could mend if she had to, but who did not particularly want to. The dresses smelled of the rooms. She would have walked slowly into the sitting room. The sitting room would have been quiet. The dust would have been everywhere, in its various accumulating layers. The newspapers along the walls would have stood in their patient stacks. Ida would have moved to her chair, the chair she preferred, the chair that had become, over the years, indented in the precise shape of her. She would have sat down. She would have, perhaps, taken a moment to listen to the small silence of the rooms before anything else began. Mary would have woken next in the bedroom. Mary slept lightly in those years. She was very thin. She moved when she moved, with the careful tentativeness of a woman whose bones had grown light. She would have come into the sitting room in her own gown of equal antiquity, and would have nodded to her sister, and would have settled into her own chair. There would have been, perhaps, almost no words exchanged. The sisters had reached, by this stage of their lives together, the kind of communication that does not require speech. They had known each other for too long. They had lived together for too long. The morning greeting was a small acknowledgement, a small confirmation, a small acceptance that the day had begun and that the two of them were once again present in it. Emma would have woken last. Emma slept the latest. Whether this was temperament or whether it was simple weariness from the strange life she had been given, we cannot say. She would have come, eventually, into the sitting room and would have taken her own place. The three of them would have been gathered in their chairs in the silent, thick-aired sitting room, while the strip of light from the window crept slowly across the carpet. Breakfast, when there was breakfast, was simple. There might have been tea brewed weak by Ida on the small hot plate. There might have been bread brought up by the porter the day before, eaten now in slices that were beginning just slightly to harden. There might have been a small saucer of condensed milk, sweet and thick. The three of them would have eaten in their chairs, slowly, with the small spoons or the small pieces of bread held delicately between thin fingers. They would not have spoken much. After breakfast, Ida would have read the newspapers. The porter brought them up each morning. He left them outside the door, and Ida or Mary or Emma, whichever felt most able that day, would have taken them in. Ida read carefully. She read every page that interested her, which was most pages, the financial pages, the political pages, the international news, the local news, the small police reports, and the descriptions of weather, and the announcements of openings and closings of businesses around the city. She knew the names of the editors. She knew the styles of the columnists. She had been reading these papers since they were edited by men whose names she remembered from her younger years, and she could see in the styles of the writing the slow shifts of generations. Mary in her chair would have done very little. She might have looked through a newspaper herself. She might have stared for long periods at some particular point on the wall, or at the curtains, or at the window. She might have closed her eyes occasionally and napped, the brief light naps of the very old. She did not read much. She did not, by all accounts, do much of anything. She simply sat. She simply continued to be present in the rooms. Emma in her chair did slightly more. Emma sometimes did small handwork, sewing or embroidery on whatever scraps of fabric the household had available. She sometimes wrote, in a small notebook of her own, though what she wrote we do not know because the notebooks were not preserved. She sometimes simply sat the way Mary sat, watching the slow changes of light in the rooms. Lunch, when it occurred, was as small as breakfast. A piece of fish, perhaps, prepared by Ida on the hot plate, or simply more bread, or simply more tea. The three of them ate small amounts. They were old, and they were sedentary, and they did not require much fuel to keep going. They had developed over the years the kind of slow, steady metabolic patience of people whose bodies have learned to do more with less. The afternoons were the longest part of the day. The light, having reached its strongest point at midday, began its long, slow retreat across the room. Ida might have, by this hour, finished with the newspapers and turned to her account books. She kept these in a drawer in the small table near her chair. She would take them out, open them carefully, and review the entries. She would add new entries in her careful, sloping hand. The hand had gotten less steady over the years. The lines wavered, the numbers tilted, but the meaning was always clear. So much in, so much out, such and such still on hand. The accounts were her great satisfaction, in a way. They were the proof that her project was still functioning, that the careful preservation of resources was still being achieved. Mary might, in the afternoon, have been moved to a slightly different chair, or might have simply continued to sit. The shifts were minimal. The afternoon turned into evening so gradually that no one quite noticed the moment of the turn. The evenings were marked mostly by the change of light. The strip of sun on the floor disappeared. The room grew, slowly, dimmer. At some point when it became necessary, Ida would light a single lamp. The lamp had been refilled with oil only when oil was absolutely required. The household used very little light. The lamp burned in the corner, casting a small yellow circle of illumination, and the rest of the room receded into the deeper greyness of evening. Dinner, if there was dinner, was again small. Often it was simply the same things they had eaten earlier. The women were not, by this stage, particularly interested in food. Food was fuel. Food was the small ritual of putting things into one's mouth. It was not, it had stopped being, the social or sensual experience that food can be in a fuller life. After dinner, after the small lamp had burned for a few hours, the three of them would have gone to bed. The going was simple. They were already in their dresses, more than half undressed for sleep, since they did not change into nightgowns regularly. They would have moved to their beds. They would have lain down. They would have slept. The deep, tired sleep of the old, the sleep that comes easily when one has done very little in the day and has very little to anticipate in the next. This was a day. This was, with small variations, every day. For more than 2 decades. The variations existed. There were better days and worse days. There were days when one of them was ill and required more attention. There were days when something interesting happened in the newspapers, and Ida talked about it more than usual. There were days, perhaps, when one of them remembered something old and shared the memory, and the others listened, and a small, slow conversation moved through the rooms like a thin breeze. But mostly the days were the same. The days were the days. The days became, over time, almost a single day, repeated and repeated until the boundaries between days dissolved, and the women lived in a kind of long, undifferentiated time that was less like a sequence and more like a single, continuous moment, slowly extending, slowly stretching out, slowly settling into the deep stillness that would, at last, contain it all. The seasons came and went, even in the suite. The women felt them, even though they did not go out to meet them. In the winters, the rooms grew cold. The hotel provided some heat, through the steam radiators that hissed and clanked in the corner. But the heat was not always sufficient, and the women wrapped themselves in shawls, in extra blankets, in whatever woolens they had kept from earlier years. The window glass, on the coldest mornings, would have small ferns of frost on the inside. The breath of the 3 women, in the early hours, would have made small clouds in the air. They would have drunk their weak tea more frequently, simply for the warmth of it. They would have sat closer to the radiator when it was working, and pulled their shawls tighter around their shoulders when it was not. In the springs the rooms warmed, the radiators stopped clanking. The window, at certain hours, might be opened a small amount to allow a breath of the new air to enter. The new air smelled, even 5 floors up, of something different from winter air. There was a freshness in it. There was the faint trace of green, even in Midtown Manhattan, where the trees in the small squares were beginning to leaf out. The women would have noticed this. They would not have spoken of it, perhaps, but they would have noticed. The body knows, even when the mind has stopped attending, when the season has turned. In the summers, the rooms grew hot. The hotel had no air conditioning, of course. No building had air conditioning in the sense that modern buildings have it. The window had to be opened, and the heat that came in was the heavy heat of New York summers, full of the smells of the city and the sounds of the city and the faint pulse of activity from the streets below. The women perspired in their dresses. They drank more water and tea and the small servings of milk they sometimes had. They moved less when they could move less, conserving their energy against the weight of the air. The cracker tins and the shoeboxes and the various caches of money sat patiently in their hiding places, indifferent to temperature. The papers in the stacks along the walls grew slightly more yellow each summer, baked gently by the heat of the sun coming through the curtains. In the autumns, the rooms cooled again. The window was closed. The radiators began their slow preparations for the winter ahead, with their occasional preliminary clanks as the boilers in the basement of the hotel were tested for the coming season. The light through the window began to slant differently. It came in at a lower angle from the south as the sun moved toward its winter quarters. The strip of sun on the carpet, which had been shorter in summer because the sun was higher, grew longer in autumn, reaching further into the room each afternoon. Ida, in her chair, would have noted these small differences without commenting on them. They were the small calendar of her enclosed years, the only calendar that mattered to her by then. Years passed in this rhythm, then more years, then more. There must have been moments, in the long stretches of the years, when something happened to interrupt the pattern. There must have been a rainstorm so heavy that the rain came in through the window before the women could close it, and the rug got wet, and they stood looking at the wet rug for some minutes before deciding what to do. There must have been a night when one of them had a bad dream and woke the others. There must have been a day when the porter forgot to bring the newspaper, and Ida had to send word down to ask for it. And the porter apologized profusely and brought up the newspaper 20 minutes later, embarrassed. There must have been small celebrations of birthdays, perhaps, with a small extra portion of something for dinner, or a small candle, or a small acknowledgement between the three of them that another year had passed. There must have been small illnesses, and small recoveries, and small fevers that came and went without serious consequence. These small interruptions to the pattern are not recorded. The historical record gives us only the broad outline, but we can imagine that the small interruptions happened, because they happen in any life. Even the most routinized existence has its small variations. Even the most sealed-off room has its small surprises. The three women lived their lives, and lives are made of these small things, whether or not those small things ever get written down. What is also true is that the lives slowly were ending. The bodies of the three women, which had been old when they entered the suite, were now, after 22 years, very old indeed. Mary's bones had grown so light that she moved like a leaf in a small breeze. Ida's hands had become spotted and translucent, the veins standing out against the thin skin. Emma, the youngest, had aged from her late 40s into her late 60s or early 70s. The women were not the women they had been. They had become gradually the women they would be at the end. And the end, though no one in the suite could have predicted exactly when it would arrive, was, as ends always are, drawing slowly nearer. While the three women sat in their two rooms, the world outside changed in ways that almost no one alive in 1907 could have foreseen. The first great change was the war. In the summer of 1914, the long peace of Europe, the peace that had held more or less since the fall of Napoleon, almost a century before, was broken by an assassination in a city most Americans could not have located on a map. The Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, was shot in Sarajevo. Within weeks, the great powers of Europe were at war. Within months, the war had become the largest conflict in human history. Within years, it would consume an entire generation of young men in fields and trenches across France and Belgium and elsewhere. The United States stayed out of the war for nearly 3 years. In April of 1917 it entered. American boys boarded ships and sailed for Europe. The newspapers were full of the news of the war, full of the names of battles and the lists of casualties and the great speeches of presidents and prime ministers. In the cities of America, including New York, there were rallies, parades, the great public emotions of a country at war. Ida read about it in her newspapers. She read about the Lusitania. She read about the trenches. She read eventually about the armistice in November of 1918, which ended the war and seemed, briefly, to promise that nothing like it would ever happen again. She read the obituaries of young men whose families had once attended her dinners. She read the long lists of the dead. She did not, however, leave the rooms. The war passed her by, in the immediate physical sense. She read about it the way someone in a different country might have read about it, observing it as a distant event. The war did not knock on her door. It did not come up the elevator. It did not enter the suite on the 5th floor. The war was a thing in newspapers, like the weather. The second great change was the influenza. In the autumn of 1918, and through the spring of 1919, a strain of influenza moved across the world, killing tens of millions of people. It was one of the worst pandemics in recorded history. It killed more people, by some estimates, than the war. It moved through cities with terrible speed. It killed the young and the strong, sometimes overnight. The hospitals overflowed. The morgues overflowed. The cemeteries dug long trenches because individual graves could not be made fast enough. In New York, the influenza killed thousands. The bodies piled up. The streets in the worst weeks were eerily empty. People stayed indoors, those who could. They wore masks when they had to go out. They watched their neighbours disappear, and they wondered if they would be next. The 3 women in the suite at the Herald Square Hotel were, in their isolated way, in one of the safest places in the city. The closed door had become, accidentally, a quarantine. They did not go out. Almost no one came in. The flu, for all its devastating reach, did not find its way through the gap under the door of suite 550-something. The 3 women, who had withdrawn from the world for reasons of their own, were saved by their withdrawal from a danger they had not anticipated. The flu passed. The cemeteries gradually closed their long trenches. The world picked itself up and tried to go on. The third great change was the transformation of New York itself. The city of 1907, the city Ida had walked through on her trip to the bank, was a city of horse-drawn carriages and gas lamps and 4-story buildings, a city whose tallest structure had been a Gothic spire. By the 1920s, the city was something almost entirely different. The horses were gone, replaced by automobiles whose engines made a new kind of urban noise, a deeper mechanical hum. The gas lamps were gone, replaced by electric lights that burned brighter and steadier and did not require a man with a long pole. The buildings were taller. They had been growing taller throughout Ida's lifetime, but the growth accelerated dramatically in the years she was sealed in her rooms. The Woolworth building had risen to nearly 800 feet. Other towers had followed. The skyline that we now think of as the iconic New York skyline, the sharp, jagged edge of stone and steel against the sky, was being built story by story, while Ida watched the small slice of city visible from her single window. She would have heard the construction perhaps on quiet mornings, the faint clang of riveting, the distant calls of the workers, the slow, patient assembling of buildings that would change the way the city looked forever. She would have read about them in the newspapers. She would have known abstractly that the city was becoming a different city. But she did not see most of it. She saw what was visible from her window, which was a particular block of Broadway that, while changing, did not change as dramatically as the rest. The buildings on her block stayed roughly the same. The street outside stayed roughly the same. The traffic on the street, while it shifted from horses to automobiles, was still traffic, still passing below her, still going somewhere that did not concern her. The fourth great change was the change in fashion, in custom, in social expectation. The world Ida had known as a young woman, the world of the 1860s and 70s, had been a world of strict propriety. Women wore long dresses. They wore corsets. They wore hats with veils. They did not, except in very particular contexts, leave their houses without male escorts. They did not vote. They did not generally attend universities. They did not, except in narrowly defined fields, work for wages. By the 1920s, all of this had begun to change. Women had won the vote in 1920. Women were attending universities in growing numbers. Women were working in offices, in factories, in shops. They were wearing shorter dresses. They were cutting their hair in the boyish styles called bobs. They were dancing the Charleston in nightclubs. They were drinking illegally in speakeasies, because in 1920 Prohibition had also arrived, making the manufacture and sale of alcohol illegal in the United States. Ida read about it. She read about the flappers, the new style of young women who shocked their elders by their dress and their behaviour. She read about the speakeasies and the gangsters who supplied them. She read about Prohibition. She read, perhaps with a faint old amusement, about the elaborate efforts of bootleggers to bring liquor across the Canadian border and the elaborate efforts of federal agents to stop them. The world had become a different world. The women of her own youth, the women who had come to her dinners in the 1870s, had they still been alive, would not have recognised it. The young women of the 1920s, with their cigarettes and their cocktails and their shortened skirts, would not have recognised her. The two worlds, the world she had come of age in and the world she now lived alongside, were as different as if they had been on different planets. It is worth pausing, in this slow and quiet hour, to think about what she could hear from the window of her suite. She could not see much. The window looked out on a fairly ordinary slice of the city, a piece of Broadway and the buildings opposite, and her eyesight, by the later years, was not what it had been. But she could hear. The hearing came up through the open window in summer, when the heat in the suite forced her to allow a little air, and it came through the closed window even in winter, muted but still present. In the early years of the retreat, in the years before the war, the sound had been the sound of a city of horses, hooves on pavement, all day and into the night, the clatter of iron rims on wagon wheels, the shouting of teamsters, the bells of streetcars, the high voices of newsboys hawking the morning and evening editions. Beneath all of this, the steady undertone of a million voices, the voices of pedestrians on sidewalks talking to each other and to themselves, the voices of merchants in doorways calling out their wares, the great low rumble of human conversation that any city makes when enough people are gathered in close enough proximity. By the war years, the sound was changing. Automobiles had begun to mix with the horses. The new mechanical sounds, the engines and the horns, were entering the texture of the city. The horns were at first a kind of novelty. Drivers honked them more or less at random, partly to warn pedestrians and partly to enjoy the noise their new machines could make. The horses were still there, but they were beginning to be outnumbered, and the smells changed accordingly. The strong, sweet smell of horse, which had pervaded every American city for centuries, was beginning to give way to the sharper smell of gasoline and exhaust. By the 20s, the horses were nearly gone. The sound of the city was now mostly the sound of motors. The horns had become more orderly, in the sense that they were used for specific signals rather than for general expression, but they were also more numerous. The traffic, all motors now, made a continuous low roar that was different from the earlier sound of the horse city. The earlier sound had been organic, varied, full of small individual noises that one could pick out. The new sound was more uniform, more mechanical, a kind of single low hum punctuated by the sharper notes of horns and the occasional siren of an emergency vehicle. The sirens, for that matter, were a new thing. The early years of the retreat had had bells on the police wagons and the fire wagons. By the 20s, the bells had largely been replaced by sirens, which carried farther and were more distinctive. The siren was, in some sense, the characteristic new sound of the modern city, the sound that had not existed in any previous era of human history, and it was a sound that Ida, in her quiet rooms, came to know well. There were also increasingly the sounds of music. In the years before the war, music in public spaces had been mostly the music of bands at parades and the music of organ grinders on certain corners. By the 20s, music had begun to spill out of the new establishments, the speakeasies and the dance halls and the clubs. Jazz had arrived in New York from the south, and it had transformed the city's nighttime soundscape. Pianos, saxophones, trumpets, drums. The new music was looser, more improvisational, more energetic than anything that had existed before. It was music for the new young women in their bobs and their short dresses. It was music for the new young men in their wide-shouldered suits. It was the soundtrack of a generation that had decided to take its pleasures more openly than its parents had, and to take them louder. The new music drifted up to Ida's window from time to time, when a club had opened nearby, when a party was happening in the streets, when the soft summer air carried the notes farther than usual. She would have heard it. She would have known what it was, more or less. She would have known, as anyone who reads newspapers knows, that this was what the young people were doing now, that the music she could hear from her window was the music of a world she would not enter. There were also the new entertainments that did not produce sounds she could hear, but that she knew about because the newspapers reported them. Radio, in particular, became a new presence in American life during the years she sat in her suite. Families across the country gathered around their radios in the evenings, listening to programs that came from distant cities, listening to comedians and singers and dramatic serials, listening, eventually, to the great radio voices that would shape political life for decades. Ida did not have a radio. She did not, by all accounts, want one. But she read about radio the way she read about everything else, and she knew that the country in which she still technically lived was being transformed, hour by hour, by this new technology that pulled distant voices into ordinary living rooms. The cinema was another new presence. Movies, which had been a small novelty when Ida first entered the suite, had become by the 20s a major industry. The silent films of the early years had given way, by the late 20s, to talkies, in which the actors actually spoke. The faces of movie stars, the new kind of celebrity that the cinema had produced, were everywhere, on posters and in magazines and in the newspapers. Mary Pickford, Charlie Chaplin, Greta Garbo. Names that had not existed when Ida was a younger woman were now, by the time she was an old woman, more famous than the names of the senators and presidents she had known. She read about all of it. She read with the attention of a woman who had nothing else to do. The newspapers were her one window into the changing world, and she watched the world through them with a kind of slow, careful curiosity, as a botanist might watch the development of a strange new plant from the safety of a laboratory. And there was also, all this time, the financial world that Ida watched so carefully. The decade after the war was a decade of rising markets. The American economy expanded. The stock market, which had been stable for years, began in the mid-1920s to climb steadily, and then, in the late 1920s, to climb dramatically. Stocks that had cost $10 came to cost $50, then $100, then more. The newspapers were full of stories of ordinary Americans making fortunes by buying shares. Stockbrokers became cultural figures. Margin loans, which allowed buyers to purchase stocks with only a fraction of the cost in cash, became widespread. The market became, in the late 20s, a kind of national obsession. Ida did not buy any of it. Her money sat in cash, in the suite. She did not speculate. She did not invest. She read the financial pages, but she did not act. She had decided long before that she would hold cash, and she held cash, and she would continue to hold cash through whatever happened to the markets, to the country, to the world. In October of 1929, the markets crashed. The crash was sudden. It was, in the way of such things, partly inevitable and partly mysterious. The boom had been built on too much margin debt, on too much speculation, on too many people borrowing too much money to buy stocks they could not really afford. When confidence wavered, the whole structure came apart in a few terrible weeks. The newspapers were full of new headlines. Fortunes wiped out, brokerages bankrupt, millionaires reduced to penniless overnight. The stories were everywhere. Ida read them, in her room. She would have read them with a particular kind of recognition. She had foreseen, in some abstract way, the possibility of exactly this kind of event. She had positioned herself for 2 decades against exactly this kind of risk. The cash in her suite had not gone up in value, of course, while the market was rising. She had missed the boom. But the cash had also not gone down in value when the market crashed. While millions of Americans were watching their savings evaporate, while banks were beginning to fail, while the country slid toward what would become the Great Depression, Ida sat in her 2 rooms with her tins and her shoeboxes and her drifts of bills, and she was, in the most literal sense, exactly as wealthy on the day after the crash as she had been on the day before. She had been right. She had been right for 22 years. The cash had been the answer. The closed door had been the answer. The whole strange retreat had been, in the cold logic of preservation, vindicated. It is worth lingering for a moment on the strangeness of this vindication. Across the city, in the autumn of 1929, men were jumping from the windows of office buildings. The image is part of the mythology of the crash, and like much mythology, it is partly true and partly exaggerated. But the underlying reality is real. Fortunes that had taken lifetimes to build were destroyed in a matter of days. Men who had thought themselves secure discovered that their security had been borrowed, that the houses and cars and accounts they had treated as their own had been resting on margin loans and credit arrangements that could be called in at a moment's notice. The depression that followed deepened. Banks failed. By 1933, more than 9,000 banks had failed across the country. Depositors who had believed their money was safe in banks discovered that there was no federal insurance, no guarantee, no protection beyond the solvency of the particular institution where their money happened to be. When the institution failed, the money was gone. The savings of decades evaporated in an afternoon. Ida had foreseen this. She had foreseen it not in 1929, when most observers were still confident that the boom would continue, but in 1907, when she had walked to her bank and demanded her money in cash. She had built her retreat around an assumption that most of her contemporaries had thought paranoid. She had assumed that the financial system could fail. She had assumed that the only truly safe form of wealth was wealth that one could touch, that one could see, that one could keep in a tin in one's own room. Most of her contemporaries had been wrong about this. She had been right. But the rightness was a strange thing. She had paid an enormous price for it. She had spent 22 years in 2 rooms. She'd given up nearly all human contact beyond her sister and her daughter. She had lived in dust and dim light and on a diet that would horrify any nutritionist. She had, in a sense, traded the better part of her old age for the certainty that her money would survive. And the money had survived, as she had wished. But what was the money for in the end? She had not spent it. She would not now spend it. It would go eventually to people she had never met, people who would carry the names of cousins she had not spoken to in 80 years. This is one of the deep ironies of her story. The careful preservation had been so complete that the thing preserved had ceased, almost, to have any meaning beyond the fact of its preservation. The money had become, by the end, an end in itself, a thing to be guarded simply because it was the thing one guarded, a thing whose original purpose, whatever that had been forgotten or abandoned somewhere along the long path of the retreat. Or perhaps not abandoned. Perhaps for Ida the original purpose had always been the guarding itself. Perhaps she had never really intended to spend the money on anything in particular. Perhaps the money had been, from the very beginning, simply the proof that she was no longer Ellen Walsh. The proof that she was no longer the small Irish girl in the small Boston room. The proof that she had crossed the great divide, and that nothing could now drag her back across it. The money was insurance against returning. As long as she had the money, she would never have to return. As long as the money sat in its tins, she was secure in the place she had reached. This reading takes the money seriously not as wealth, but as identity. The money was who she was. The money was the difference between Ellen and Ida. To spend it would have been to begin, slowly, the dissolution of the careful construction she had spent her life maintaining. So she did not spend it. She held it. She held it the way one holds a talisman, the way one holds the small object that keeps the bad spirits away. By this reading, the strange diet, the closed door, the dust on the furniture, all of it makes a different kind of sense. It was not the eccentric behaviour of a woman who had lost her grip on the world. It was the disciplined behaviour of a woman who understood with absolute clarity what her life had been built on. The money was the foundation. The foundation had to be preserved. Everything else, the comforts and the social pleasures and the small luxuries that wealth ordinarily provides, was secondary. They could be sacrificed. They had to be sacrificed, perhaps, to keep the foundation intact. The foundation was intact on the day the markets crashed. The foundation was intact on the day the door of the suite was finally opened. The foundation, in fact, was just as intact as it had been 22 years before, when Ida had walked out of the bank with the bundles of cash. Nothing had been lost. The project had succeeded. Ida had won in the long contest she'd been running against the unpredictability of the world. She was, by then, 92 years old, or 93, or possibly older. The exact number depended on which of her stories one believed. She had spent more than 20 years in 2 rooms. She had seen, through her newspapers, the world she had withdrawn from convulse and reshape itself into something almost unrecognizable. She had outlived the Great War. She had outlived the Great Influenza. She had outlived the boom. She had now outlived the bust. But the long retreat was approaching its end. Not because Ida had decided to end it. She had no such intention. The retreat was approaching its end because, finally, after 22 years of paying her bills and demanding nothing of the hotel and asking only to be left alone, the world was about to push, gently, on her closed door. The push, when it came, was not violent. It was not a raid or a forced entry. It was, like so many things in Ida's life, a small administrative matter. A bill went unpaid, perhaps, in those first uncertain weeks of the new economic darkness. Or a hotel manager grew curious, or a relative somewhere finally tracked her down. The exact mechanism is not entirely clear, but sometime in the early months of 1931, the door of suite 550-something at the Herald Square Hotel was, for the first time in 22 years, opened from the outside. What was found inside became one of the most discussed stories in the New York newspapers of that year. The discovery happened in stages gently, in the careful way that institutions handled the affairs of elderly women in the years before any direct intervention. There was a knock, there was a pause, there was a voice. There was perhaps a small consultation through the door. The first questions were asked, the first answers given, and then slowly, with consent or with the carefully managed appearance of consent, the door swung open. The man who walked in early 1931, was a lawyer. His name does not need to detain us in detail. He was a representative of certain interests, a man brought in to investigate the situation of Mrs. Ida Mayfield Wood, who had been, for some years now, the subject of mild concern among the few people in the world who still remembered that she existed. There were questions about her finances, there were questions about her property, there were questions, ultimately, about who her heirs would be when, as the lawyer must have understood, she died, which could not be very far off because she was by any calculation very old. The lawyer entered the sitting room first. The sitting room was, by the time he saw it, a sight that few people in 1931 would have been prepared for. The sitting room was thick with dust. The dust was not the ordinary dust of a room that has been neglected for a few weeks. It was the dust of a room that had been allowed to gather dust for more than 2 decades. It coated every surface. It softened the edges of every piece of furniture. It hung in the air, faintly, in the slanting light from the curtained windows, so that the air itself seemed to be a kind of slow, pale fog. The furniture was the furniture that had been there in 1907. None of it had been moved, none of it replaced. The sofa was still where the hotel had originally placed it. The chairs were where they had always been. The lamps were where they had always been. The patterns on the upholstery, once visible, were now muted by years of dust and by the slow yellowing of fabrics in dim light. The newspapers were in piles. They were everywhere. They were stacked along the walls, sometimes to the height of a man's waist, sometimes higher. They were the newspapers Ida had been reading every day for 2 decades. She had not thrown them away. She had kept them, perhaps for some reason she could have articulated, perhaps for no reason at all. The stacks of newspapers formed walls of their own, narrow corridors through the room, an interior architecture made of accumulated paper. The smell of the room was distinctive. It was the smell of old paper, dry and slightly sweet. It was the smell of dust. It was the smell of clothes that had not been laundered. It was the smell of 3 older bodies in close quarters for many years. It was not perhaps as terrible as it might sound. It was simply the smell of a sealed environment that had aged in its own way. And in the midst of all this, sitting in a chair, was Ida. She was, by then, 93 years old. The lawyer would not have known her exact age, but he would have seen immediately that she was very old. She was small. She had become smaller over the years, as the elderly often do, the body folding inward into itself. She was wearing, by his account, a gown that had once been an elegant garment, but was now, after years of wear and no laundering, in a condition that he would later describe with a kind of careful indirection. The gown was filthy. The lace at the collar was disintegrating, the cuffs were frayed, the hem was torn in places. Her hair was white, it was long, the way many older women of her generation wore their hair, but it was untended. It hung loose, or was pinned only carelessly with simple pins. Her face was thin, her eyes were sharp. She looked at the lawyer when he came in. She did not seem alarmed. She seemed, by every account that survives, calm. She was perhaps at this stage beyond surprise. She had spent more than 20 years preparing for various forms of intrusion, and now that one had finally come, she seemed to have decided to handle it with the dignity she had always managed to summon when it was needed. She greeted him, she invited him to sit, she offered him, perhaps, some small courtesy, the way a proper lady would offer a courtesy to a visitor in her own home. The visitor sat. He looked around. He took in, slowly, what he was seeing. In the bedroom, which the lawyer eventually entered, the situation was even more striking. There were 2 more women there, Mary, the silent sister, and Emma, the daughter. Mary was, by then, around 88 years old. She was very frail. She was lying down or sitting, almost mute, almost unresponsive. She looked, the lawyer thought, as if she had not been entirely well for some time. Emma was younger, around 70, but she too was thin and weakened by the long indoor life, and by the spare diet of fish and crackers and condensed milk that the household had subsisted on. The bedroom was as dust-thick as the sitting room. The beds were made up after a fashion, but the bedding was old and grey. The wardrobe stood open, or partially open, revealing the same dresses that had been in it 20 years before. The bathroom, the lawyer would have noted, was in a condition that he did not need to describe in detail to convey what 20 years of intermittent maintenance had produced. And the money. The money was, of course, why he was there in the first place. There were rumours of money. There had always been rumours, even during the long years of silence, that Mrs. Wood had a great deal of money in the suite. The lawyer had come prepared to find some money. He had not been prepared to find what he found. The money was everywhere. It was in the cracker tins, of which there were many. It was in shoeboxes under the beds. It was in the wardrobe in stacks. It was in the drawers of the dresser. It was wedged behind the cushions of the sofa. It was inside the linings of certain dresses hanging in the wardrobe. It was inside the folds of the curtains. It was rolled into the cores of certain newspapers. It was in places the lawyer had not yet looked, because there had not yet been time to look in all the places. There was, by the eventual count, well over $700,000 in cash in the rooms. Some accounts put the figure higher, some put it closer to $1 million. The exact total would take days to assemble and verify, because the money was distributed across so many small caches, and because Ida herself, even in her advanced age, knew where most of it was and did not particularly want to tell anyone. There were also, scattered throughout the suite, items of considerable value. There was jewellery. There were diamonds. There was a particular diamond necklace, by some accounts, of remarkable size and quality. There were rings and brooches and pendants. There were old certificates, some of which represented stocks, some of which represented bonds, some of which were simply old and uncertain papers that no one was sure what to do with. There were letters, there were photographs, there were small odds and ends that, in any house, accumulate over decades, but here they had accumulated in particularly unusual concentrations, mixed in with all the cash and all the dust and all the newspapers. The lawyer left the suite after that first visit, with the strong impression that he had seen something almost without precedent. He went and made his reports. Other people came, doctors came, eventually, officials came, reporters came, when they could, because the story by then had begun to leak, and once it began to leak it spread through the city like a fire in dry grass. The newspapers had finally found their next great Ida Mayfield Wood story, more than 20 years after they had stopped writing about her. The headlines ran on the front pages: the hidden hoard, the shut-in widow, the fortune in the cracker tins, the peculiar diet, the old gowns, the dust on the furniture. Every detail was reported, and where the details were not known they were sometimes invented, in the way that newspapers in 1931 still freely invented details when the facts were insufficient to fill the column. For Ida, who had spent her whole life carefully managing what was known about her, the sudden public exposure must have been excruciating. But there is little record of her response. By the time the story broke, she was already being moved out of the suite, gently, carefully. She was being taken to a place where she could be looked after properly, fed properly, examined by doctors. She was, in a sense, already passing out of her own story. The story would now be conducted around her and after her by other people. The transition out of the suite must have been, in its own quiet way, one of the strangest experiences of her long life. Imagine her, please, on the morning when she finally left those rooms for the last time. She was small and frail, dressed in some hastily improved version of her old gown, her hair newly washed and combed by attendants who had been brought in for the purpose. She was helped to her feet. She was helped across the sitting room, past the chair where she had sat for so many afternoons, past the stacks of newspapers that had been her wallpaper for 22 years. She was helped to the door. The door, when it opened for her, opened onto a hallway she had not seen in a very long time. The carpet of the hallway was a different carpet than she remembered. The light in the hallway was electric where she remembered it as gas. The colours of things were different. The smells were different. Even the air, the simple air of the hotel hallway, had a different quality, fresher and brighter and more open than the air she had been breathing for so long. She would have walked slowly to the elevator. The elevator was a more modern model than the one that had carried her up to the 5th floor in 1907. The doors slid open differently. The interior was panelled in a different style. She would have stepped in, with help, and ridden down to the lobby that had also changed in 22 years, the lobby with its new furniture and new lighting, and the strange fashions of the people sitting in it. The lobby would have looked at her. People would have looked at her. The story had broken in the newspapers by then, and the staff and guests of the hotel knew, by various rumours, that a peculiar elderly woman had been discovered on the 5th floor. Some of them would have been curious. Some of them would have been polite enough to look away. Ida, walking through that lobby, would have been, perhaps for the first time in 2 decades, an object of public attention. The performances she had once given had been performances of grace, of refinement, of cultivated belonging. The performance she was now obliged to give simply by walking through a room was the performance of a curiosity. She was the woman in the news. She was the lady from the cracker tins. She handled it, by all accounts, with composure. She did not seem distressed. She greeted the people who needed to be greeted. She allowed herself to be helped where help was offered. She moved through the lobby with the same quiet poise that she had moved through grander lobbies in her younger years. The poise itself, that gift of bearing that she had cultivated over so many decades, did not abandon her at the end. It was, perhaps, the last thing she had. It carried her out of the hotel and into a waiting car and away to whatever institutional care had been arranged. The suite, when she left it, was sealed. Officials guarded it. The contents were too valuable to be left unguarded. Reporters would have liked to see inside, but most were turned away. A few photographs were taken eventually by official photographers who documented the rooms for the legal record. Those photographs survived, and they show, in the grainy black and white of the period, the strange archaeology of the long retreat, the chairs with their soft outlines of dust, the newspapers in their patient stacks, the wardrobe with its old dresses, the cracker tins on their shelves, a whole world stilled and recorded on the day after its inhabitants left it for good. The work of inventorying the suite took weeks. There were so many small caches of money. There were so many small caches of jewellery. There were so many old papers, some of them important, most of them not. The investigators worked carefully, recording everything, photographing everything, packing everything into proper containers for transport to secured storage. The whole strange contents of the rooms were extracted piece by piece and removed. When the rooms were finally empty, when the last cracker tin had been carried out and the last newspaper had been bundled away, and the dust had been swept into bins and dropped down the hotel's rubbish chutes, the rooms were just rooms again. 2 rooms in a hotel with their original wallpaper and their original carpets and their windows looking out, on one side, toward Broadway. The hotel would clean them, repaint them perhaps, redecorate them, and rent them out to new guests who would have no idea what had occurred in those rooms during the long quiet years before they arrived. Such is the way of cities. The rooms move on, the buildings move on. The traces of the lives that have been lived in them are erased by paint and plaster and the small unceasing labour of janitorial work, until even the memory of the lives is preserved only in newspaper clippings and in the decisions of which stories the newspapers themselves choose, in subsequent decades, to remember and which they choose to forget. The days immediately after the discovery had a strange quality. The story moved very quickly in the press, but for the 3 women who had spent so many years in the suite, the days moved at the slow pace they had always moved. Ida was now in some institutional setting, a hospital perhaps, or a quiet private room arranged by her custodians. The bed she slept in was a different bed. The food she was given was different food. The light came in through windows that looked out on a different view. None of these things perhaps struck her with great force. She had become in the long retreat a person for whom the immediate physical surroundings were less important than the inner space she carried with her. The new bed was, in essential ways, the same bed. She had been ready perhaps for a long time to be moved. Mary, in those last days, was almost beyond awareness of her surroundings. She was an old woman approaching the end of her life. She slept much. She woke briefly perhaps to take a little water or a little soup. She did not, by any reliable account, speak much during these final days. Whatever she had to say to Ida had been said in the rooms, over the years. Whatever needed to be communicated between the 2 sisters had passed between them long since, in the long companionship of 2 people who had shared a life so completely that words had become, by the end, almost unnecessary. Emma was the most disoriented. She had been, even in the suite, the youngest of the 3. Now, suddenly, she was being asked to interact with a world she had not entered for 2 decades. People came to speak with her. They asked her questions. They tried to determine, with the patience that the situation required, how much she understood about her mother's affairs, how much she knew about the hidden caches of money, what her wishes were regarding the practical matters that had to be decided. Emma did her best to answer, but her answers were not always coherent. The rooms had perhaps slowed her mind. The diet had perhaps weakened her. Whatever she might have been in another life, she'd become in this one a woman who could not entirely meet the demands of a world that was suddenly asking things of her. The custodians who looked after the three women in those days were, by all accounts, kind. They understood that the women were not criminals. They were not even, in any clinical sense, mentally ill in ways that required restraint. They were simply very old women who had lived an unusual life and who needed to be tended with patience and respect. The custodians fed them. The custodians made sure they were warm. The custodians accepted the slow rhythms of three people who had for a long time been moving at speeds that the outside world had largely forgotten how to accommodate. This was a small mercy in the larger arc of the story. Ida had been afraid, perhaps, of what the world would do when it found her. She had built her retreat partly to ensure that the world could never find her. When the world finally found her, despite all her efforts, the world turned out to be, at least in the form of the people immediately around her, gentler than she might have feared. The hotel manager had been polite, the doctor had been gentle, the custodians who took over after the discovery were patient. None of them, in those last days, treated her as a curiosity or a freak. They treated her as an old woman, and they cared for her in the way one cares for old women, with the slow, respectful gestures that humans have always used to tend to those who are approaching the end. Her sister Mary was even further gone. Mary was very near death already when the door opened. She had been, perhaps, ill for some time. The condition of the suite, the diet, the accumulated frailty of nearly 90 years, all of it had taken its toll. Mary died not long after the discovery. She slipped away, in the quiet way she had done everything in her life, having spoken almost no words for years, having lived almost entirely in her sister's shadow, having been, until the very end, Mary Mayfield, the imaginary plantation lady from a country she had never seen. Emma, the daughter, lasted somewhat longer, but she too was now an old woman. She had spent her entire adult life inside her mother's orbit, first in the houses of the Wood family, then in the increasing seclusion of the early 1900s, and finally in the long-sealed silence of the suite. The world she emerged into in 1931 was a world she did not know. She did not have skills for it. She did not have friends in it. She had, in a sense, no idea how to be a person outside the strange small ecosystem her mother had created. Ida herself died in 1932. She was 93, or she was older. The exact number, like so many things about her, would never be perfectly settled. She died, in the end, peacefully, attended by the small group of officials and lawyers who had been entrusted with her case. She did not, by all accounts, fight. She did not protest. She had perhaps been ready for the ending for a long time. She had, in some deep part of herself, perhaps already accepted that the long retreat was over and that the rest of the story would not belong to her. Her death set in motion the second great phase of her public story, the phase in which the newspapers and the lawyers and the relatives, real and imagined, fought to determine who the woman in the suite had actually been and who had a right to her enormous fortune. This phase was conducted entirely without her. She slept by then in a quiet grave. The lawyers and the relatives moved on without her permission. What they discovered, slowly, was that the woman in the suite had not been who she said she was. The fortune was the engine of the investigation. If Ida had died with no money, no one would have asked who she really was. The world would have buried her quietly under whatever name she gave, and the careful structure of her invented life would have stood, perhaps forever, as the official record. But she had died with a great deal of money, and a great deal of money in the absence of clear instructions requires the law to assign it to someone. This is the part of the story where the patient detective work began. The lawyers handling the estate needed to find Ida's heirs. The will, if there was a clear and recent will, would have settled matters quickly. But the situation was more complicated. There were old documents. There were claims and counterclaims. There were people emerging from various corners of the country and the world, asserting that they were related to Ida, that they had a right to her money, that they were, in some way, her people. The first claimants were the obvious ones. There were supposedly descendants of the Mayfield family of Louisiana. There were people who said they were her cousins, her nieces, her distant kin from the great old plantation. They came forward with stories. They came forward in some cases with documents, though the documents were often vague or unverifiable. They explained their relationships to Henry Mayfield, the gentleman planter, and to his wife, and to their various children, of whom Ida had been one. The lawyers investigated. They wrote letters to Louisiana. They asked people in Louisiana to look into the records. The records of Louisiana plantations were, by then, in various states of preservation. Some had been destroyed in the Civil War, some had been lost in fires or floods, some were intact in courthouses and in family archives. The lawyers spent months and then years sifting through what survived. What they did not find was the Mayfield plantation. There was no plantation by that name in the parts of Louisiana where Ida had said her family had lived. There were similar names. There were plantations with names that started with M, plantations with names that ended in field, plantations whose histories could be traced back into the period when the Mayfield plantation should have existed. But there was no Henry Mayfield. There was no daughter Ida Mayfield, born to that family in that place in that year. There was simply no record. The lawyers expanded the search. They wrote to other parts of the South. They wrote to genealogical societies. They wrote to the keepers of family Bibles, in which Southern families had traditionally inscribed births and marriages and deaths. They followed every thread that the surviving documents from the suite seemed to suggest. They looked for the family. The family was not there to be found. This was the first crack in the official story. The Mayfield identity, which Ida had maintained for more than 70 years, was beginning to dissolve under the steady, patient pressure of investigation. The plantation did not exist. The father did not exist. The whole southern background, the soft accent and the careful manners and the genteel decline of an old planter family was a construction that had no foundation in any actual history. But if Ida had not been a Mayfield, who had she been? This is the question that consumed the investigators for some considerable time. They went over the contents of the suite. They examined the papers. They looked at the photographs. They studied the few documents that had survived from earlier periods of Ida's life. They spoke with people who had known her, the few who were still alive and the few who had memories worth speaking about. A name began to emerge. The name was not a name that had been on any of Ida's later documents. It was a name that came from old letters, from references in correspondence she had received from someone, somewhere, decades before. The name was Ellen Walsh. The investigators followed the new name. They followed it backward. They wrote to Boston. They wrote to other parts of New England. They asked about the Walsh family. They asked about an Irish hat maker named Thomas Walsh and his wife Anne. They asked about their children, and particularly about a daughter named Ellen. And they began, slowly, to find what they were looking for. There were old census records. There were records of the Walsh family living in poor neighbourhoods of Boston in the 1840s and 50s. There were records of children, including a daughter Ellen, who appeared in some entries and not in others, as Irish family records of the period often did. There were records of the family moving eventually to New York. There were records of the brother, the sisters who had survived, the various small traces that ordinary poor families leave behind in the ledgers of the institutions that occasionally noted them. The Walsh family, unlike the Mayfield family, was real. The Walsh family had actually existed. And from the various small records, the investigators began to assemble a portrait. A poor Irish family in Boston, an immigrant father, a mother, several children. One of those children, the daughter named Ellen, who had been remarkable for her beauty and intelligence even as a young girl, who had at some point separated herself from the family, who had moved to New York, who had reinvented herself as someone else. The reinvention had been complete. The reinvention had been so complete that her own daughter Emma may not have known the truth. Her own sister Mary had certainly known the truth, but Mary had been dead for some time by the time the investigation reached its full thoroughness, and Mary in life had been bound to silence by the same ropes of necessity that bound Ida. The discovery of Ellen Walsh was a sensational story. The newspapers, which had not finished with the original story of the hidden fortune, now had a second and even more remarkable story. The grand old Mrs. Wood had not been a grand old Mrs. Wood at all. She had been, all along, an Irish girl from Boston. The plantation had been a lie. The southern background had been a lie. The whole carefully maintained identity had been a sustained, decades-long, brilliantly executed deception. The newspapers ran the story for weeks. They ran it with the particular relish of journalism that has stumbled onto something both salacious and historically rich. The headlines were various. They were sometimes mocking, sometimes admiring, sometimes simply astonished. The story became, briefly, one of the great human interest stories of the era. It became, in some sense, a kind of moral fable, though what the moral was exactly depended on which writer was writing. For the investigators, the discovery of Ellen Walsh changed everything. It meant that the heirs of Ida Mayfield Wood were not, in fact, the various Mayfield claimants who had come forward. The heirs of Ida Mayfield Wood were the descendants of the Walsh family. They were the descendants of her brothers and sisters, and the descendants of those descendants, and any of them who could prove their line of descent could, potentially, claim a share of the fortune. The Walsh descendants, when they came to be located, were not a small number. The Walsh family had been a large family, in the way that 19th century Irish-American families tended to be. There had been multiple siblings. There had been multiple marriages. There had been, by the 1930s, a substantial extended family scattered across the United States, mostly in the working-class neighbourhoods of various cities, mostly with no particular knowledge of the wealthy great-aunt who had spent 20 years in a hotel suite in New York. The investigators tracked them. The investigators wrote to them. The investigators called on them when calling was possible. And one by one the Walsh descendants came forward, looking for documentation, looking for old letters, looking for any thread that would establish their connection to the woman in the suite. The legal proceedings that followed were extensive. They went on for years. There were hearings, depositions, presentations of evidence, contested claims, refuted claims, cross-claims. There were lawyers who specialised in these matters and who built reputations on the sheer length and intricacy of the Wood case. There were genealogists who were called in to examine documents. There were small-town clerks in Massachusetts who were asked to testify about the contents of records they had not looked at in 50 years. The proceedings produced over time a great mountain of paper. The mountain grew, year after year, in the offices of the various law firms that had taken on aspects of the case. There were briefs and counter-briefs. There were affidavits sworn by people who had known the Walsh family in Boston in the 1860s, and who were now themselves very old and not entirely reliable witnesses. There were depositions taken from cousins and second cousins, and the descendants of cousins, in dim parlours in working-class neighbourhoods in cities up and down the eastern seaboard. There were photographs introduced as evidence. Family portraits in stiff Victorian poses, with the question always being, in some way, whether the woman in the photograph was the same woman who had died in the suite at the Herald Square Hotel. Some of the depositions are, in their small way, quite moving. There were old Irish Americans who'd grown up hearing stories about a great-aunt who had vanished decades before into a glamorous life in New York. They had thought, when they thought about her at all, that she had simply lost touch. They had not imagined that the great-aunt of family rumour and the famous Mrs. Wood of the newspaper headlines were the same person. When the lawyers came to their doors and explained gently what had been discovered, they were astonished. They went into back bedrooms and brought out small boxes of old letters they had been saving for decades, not knowing why they were saving them. They opened the boxes for the lawyers read the letters confirmed in their small way the connection to Ellen Walsh. There were also, of course, claimants who had no genuine connection. There were people who came forward with stories that did not hold together, with documents that proved on examination to be unreliable, with claims that depended on conveniences of memory that the lawyers and the genealogists were skilled at puncturing. The estate, with its great pile of unclaimed money, attracted, as such estates always attract, the hopeful and the dishonest in roughly equal measure. The lawyers spent considerable time sifting these claims as well, dismissing the false, encouraging the genuine, and producing eventually a sorted list of those who had been judged to be Ida's actual heirs. The judges who oversaw the proceedings were, by all accounts, careful men. They understood that the case was unusual. They understood that the woman at the centre of the case had constructed an entire false identity over many decades, and that the unravelling of that identity was a delicate matter that required patience and rigour. They listened to the lawyers. They considered the evidence. They issued rulings. The rulings were, on the whole, sensible. They confirmed the Walsh identity. They confirmed the descendants who had been able to prove their lines. They rejected the claimants who had not been able to prove anything beyond their own hopeful assertions. The press followed the proceedings with declining interest. The first sensational stories about Ellen Walsh and the Mayfield fiction had run their course by the middle of the 1930s. By the time the legal work was actually concluding, in the late 1930s the country had moved on to other concerns. The Great Depression occupied most of the front pages. The rumblings of war in Europe were beginning to occupy the rest. The estate of an old woman in a hotel suite, however peculiar her story, was no longer fresh news. This was perhaps fortunate. The slow conclusion of the Wood case proceeded, in its later years, in a kind of obscurity that allowed it to be done properly, without the pressure of daily journalistic attention. The lawyers were able to do their work without grandstanding. The judges were able to make their rulings without being second-guessed by editorial writers. The Walsh descendants were able to receive their inheritances without being besieged by photographers on their front porches. The story was allowed to subside gently into the official record where it would lie, gathering dust until some later historian came along and pulled it back out. Throughout all of this, the cash sat in the vaults of the institutions that had taken charge of it. The cracker tins were no longer in the suite. The shoeboxes were no longer under the bed. The drifts of bills had been collected, counted, and put away into the proper official kind of storage. The fortune had been removed from its long, strange home and made into ordinary fortune. It was no longer the fortune of an old woman in a hotel room. It was now simply an estate to be administered, an estate to be distributed. When the distribution finally happened, after years of legal work, the result was somewhat anticlimactic. The Walsh descendants who could prove their relationship received their shares. The shares were substantial by the standards of working-class families in the 1930s, which was a time of economic devastation. The Great Depression was deep. Unemployment was widespread. A few $1,000s from a long-lost great-aunt could, for some of these families, mean the difference between losing their homes and keeping them, between hunger and food, between the various tragedies of the period and the ordinary endurance of getting through. The fortune, in the end, did its work. It supported in small ways dozens of people Ida had never met. It paid for educations, it paid for medical bills, it paid for marriages and houses and the simple needs of families that had nothing else. It diffused, the way concentrated things eventually diffuse, into the broad continuous river of ordinary lives. And Ida, who had built the fortune so carefully, who had walked to her bank in the spring of 1907 and come away with the cash that would change her descendants' fortunes, had no opinion about any of it, because Ida was no longer there. She had become, by then, what she had always been at the foundation, beneath all the constructions. She had become again Ellen Walsh. She had become the Irish girl from Boston, the daughter of a hat maker, the small girl who had once practiced the accent of the South in a small room she had been allowed to visit. The long invention had been undone, not by anything she had done, but by the patient work of investigators after her death. It is hard to know whether she would have minded. There is a sense, reading about her quietly, that perhaps she had always known the invention would not survive her. Perhaps she had counted, in some part of herself, on the eventual exposure. Perhaps she had decided that the invention only needed to last as long as she did, and that what came after did not need to be controlled. Or perhaps she simply did not think about it. Perhaps she was so focused on the immediate daily business of preserving the money, of paying the bills, of reading the newspapers, of eating the small spare meals and watching the days go by, that the question of what the world would say about her after her death was a question she set aside as not particularly relevant. We cannot know. Ida did not leave a memoir, she did not leave a confession, she did not leave a careful explanation of her choices and her reasons. She left, instead, the rooms. She left the cracker tins and the shoeboxes and the drifts of money. She left the dust on the furniture and the piles of newspapers along the walls. She left the silence of 2 rooms in which 3 women had lived for more than 20 years, eating fish and crackers, paying their bills on time, and waiting for the long ending of the long story. She left these things, and she left in the documents that were eventually pieced together the trace of a life that was more remarkable, in its quiet way, than almost any of the lives of the great public figures who had lived alongside her. It is late now in our long and slow telling of this story. The light in the room where you are listening has perhaps grown dim. The world outside, wherever you are, has settled into whatever stillness the night brings to it. There is something worth saying, in this gentle and unhurried space, about what such a life as Ida's leaves behind for those of us who have come after her. It is tempting to look at her story and to see immediately a cautionary tale. The woman who hoarded a fortune and lived in squalor, the woman who sealed herself away from the world and ate fish and crackers in the dust, the woman who could have done so much, who could have lived so well, who could have used her resources to make her own life, and her daughter's life, and her sister's life, into something that resembled what most of us would call happiness, but who chose instead a long quiet retreat into rooms that grew gradually more strange as the years passed. This reading is available. It has been the reading that the newspapers favoured when they first told the story, and it has been the reading that many writers since have favoured. It is not wrong. There is something in it, certainly, that catches one of the truths of the story. But it is not the only reading, and in the slow, generous spirit in which we are telling this story, in the quiet hour we are sharing with Ida and Mary and Emma, and the rooms they made for themselves, it is worth pausing to consider some of the other readings that are also available. One of the other readings is this: Ida did what she felt she needed to do. She had grown up poor. She had grown up in a world that did not value her, that did not see her, that did not give her the things that more fortunate children received without effort. She had, by enormous force of will, constructed a different life for herself. The construction had been the work of decades. It had required her to suppress, to hide, to perform. It had required her, perhaps, to live with a kind of permanent low-grade fear of exposure, a fear that any wrong word could collapse the whole careful structure she had built. Maintaining such a structure must have been exhausting. Maintaining it for 40 years the way she did must have been almost beyond exhaustion. By the time her husband died and the great obligation of public life lifted from her shoulders, she may simply have been tired. She may have decided that she had performed enough. She may have decided that she had earned, by all the years of effort, the right to stop performing. The retreat to the suite was, in this reading, not a tragedy. It was a rest. It was the long and well-deserved rest of a woman who had been working in her quiet way harder than almost anyone she had ever known. Another reading is this: the money was always going to be the point. Ida had grown up in a world where the absence of money had defined everything. The neighbourhoods her family lived in, the food they ate, the diseases they caught, the respect they were or were not given, the doors that were open or closed to them. Money was not an abstraction in her childhood. It was a daily presence by its absence. The lack of it shaped every hour. It shaped what was possible to dream of, what was possible to plan for, what was possible to hope. When she left that childhood and constructed her new life, she did not, perhaps, ever quite believe that the money she had acquired was permanent. The wealthy can sometimes forget that they are wealthy. They can take it for granted. They can spend without anxiety. But people who came up from poverty, even those who become very rich, sometimes never lose the underlying sense that the money could go away. They watch it. They protect it. They cannot quite trust the world to leave it alone. Ida watched her money for 40 years before the Great Withdrawal. She watched it with the constant low alertness of a woman who had seen how easily wealth could disappear. When the panic of 1907 came, when the banks began to wobble, when the markets shook, she saw, perhaps, the possibility she had always feared. The money could go. The whole structure of her invented life, which rested ultimately on the money, could collapse. The protection she had spent her life building could fail. So she took the money out. She took all of it out. She took it home. She put it in places only she knew. She closed the door. And now, with the money under her own physical control, with no bank between her and her fortune, with no possibility of failure or fraud or war or panic touching the cash that lay in her own rooms, she could finally, for the first time in her life, rest. She could sit quietly, knowing that the worst could not happen, because the worst depended on intermediaries she had now eliminated. The cracker tins were not, in this reading, the symptoms of madness. They were, after a fashion, the achievement of perfect security. They were the answer to a question Ida had been asking herself since she was a small girl in Boston. A third reading, and perhaps the kindest, is this: the three women in the suite had each other. It is easy to imagine the rooms as a place of suffering, the dust, the spare diet, the closed door. But the rooms were also a place where three women who had spent their lives in close connection could finally be alone together, without the demands of the outside world, without the performances that society had required of them. Ida had performed for 40 years as Mrs. Wood. Mary had performed for 40 years as the silent imaginary sister from the imaginary plantation. Emma had performed for her entire life as the daughter of these two women, the inheritor of a story that had never been her story to begin with. In the suite, perhaps, the performances could finally end. There was no one to perform for. The closed door admitted no audience. The three of them could be, with each other, simply who they were. Ida could be Ellen sometimes, perhaps, when the mood was right and the curtains were drawn and the light was low. Mary could be the sister Ellen had grown up with, the small girl from the rooms in Boston, the witness to a life that no one else now living had witnessed. Emma could be, perhaps for the first time, simply Emma, daughter of these particular two women, free of the obligation to be anyone's social accomplishment. We cannot know what they said to each other in the rooms. The conversations were not recorded, but we can imagine gently that there were conversations. There must have been. Three people do not live together for 22 years in two rooms without speaking. They must have spoken. They must have remembered things. They must have, on some evenings in the slow light of a winter afternoon, told each other small stories about the past, the way old women everywhere tell each other small stories about the past, and laughed quietly and sighed, and gone on into the next moment, and the next. This reading, too, is available. It is not the most dramatic, it is not the most newsworthy. But it is the reading that takes seriously the full humanity of the three women, the fact that they were not merely peculiarities or curiosities, but were people, with relationships and feelings and memories, even in the silent and dusty rooms where they lived out their final years. There is also, in Ida's story, something that sleeps at the very deepest level, something about the long relationship between identity and survival. Ida understood, with the clarity of someone who had lived inside the question, that identity is something we make, that who we are is, to a much greater degree than we usually acknowledge, a thing we construct out of choices and performances and the accumulated weight of our own preferences over time. The world can hand us a starting place. The world can give us a name and a family and an accent and a set of expectations, but what we do with all that is, finally, our own work. Ida did her work with extraordinary thoroughness. She made a person out of the materials at hand. The person she made was beautiful, refined, gracious, and almost entirely fictional. The person she made carried her through 50 years of social existence at the highest levels of New York society. The person she made allowed her to marry into wealth, to raise a daughter in comfort, to spend her widowhood in the quiet retreat she preferred. Was the fictional person less real than the original Ellen Walsh might have been, if Ellen Walsh had simply continued to be Ellen Walsh? It is not entirely clear. The fictional person ate, she slept. She loved her husband, presumably, and her daughter and her sister. She felt joy at certain moments and disappointment at others. She experienced for 50 years the entire range of human experiences that a person experiences. The fact that the name was made up, that the background was invented, that the accent was learned, did not make any of those experiences less real to the woman having them. Identity, Ida's life seems to suggest, is not the property we are born with. It is the property we make. And the making is hard work, and not everyone undertakes it, and most who do undertake it accept the materials they have been given and work with those rather than starting from scratch. But Ida started from scratch. She made a whole new person, and that person lived a whole new life. The cost, of course, was great. The cost was the connection to the original family. The cost was the suppression of memory, the constant guarding of the past, the impossibility of ever fully relaxing into one's own history. The cost was, perhaps, a kind of permanent loneliness, even within the marriage and the household and the elegant social rounds. The Ellen Walsh inside the Ida Mayfield Wood was kept quiet, kept hidden, kept always alert. She could never fully come out. She could never fully be acknowledged. She could only watch, from inside, the woman she had built around herself, and live whatever life that woman lived. This, perhaps, is the real subject of the story. Not the money, not the dust, not the cracker tins. The subject is the Ellen who kept living all those years beneath the surface of Ida. The subject is the small Irish girl in the small room in Boston who never entirely stopped existing, even when the woman she had become was sitting in parlours with senators' wives in Lower Manhattan. The subject is the long, patient, lifelong negotiation between who we are made and who we make ourselves into. There is something else worth thinking about in this slow evening hour, something about the shape of a long life and the way the years arrange themselves in retrospect. When Ida was a small girl in Boston, she could not have imagined the suite at the Herald Square Hotel. The future that lay ahead of her was, at that age, simply the unknown blank that the future always is. She had her mother and her father, the small rooms, the smell of damp wool and coal smoke, the noise of the streets outside. That was her world. Whatever came next would come, and she would meet it as best she could. When Ida was a young woman, writing the letter that began the long correspondence with Benjamin Wood, she could not have imagined the suite either. She could imagine perhaps the marriage. She could imagine the elegant rooms, the dinners with senators, the carriage on the avenue, but not the suite, not the cracker tins, not the small old woman she would eventually become, sitting in a darkened room with a hot plate and a kettle. When Ida was a mature woman in her 40s, in the busy years of the Wood mansion, she could not have imagined the suite. The mansion was too full of life. The household was too active. The social calendar was too crowded. There was no quiet space in her imagination for the suite to take shape. It was only later, perhaps in her 60s, that the suite began to seem possible, then likely, then necessary. The journey toward the suite was not a single decision, but a slow accumulation of preferences, a gradual narrowing of the world she wanted to inhabit, a long quiet movement away from the larger spaces she had once filled toward the smaller spaces that suited the woman she was becoming. This is the way most lives go, perhaps. We do not choose in our youth the place where we will spend our old age. The place is chosen gradually by the daily small choices of all the years between. The shape of the ending is built slowly by the shape of the middle. By the time we arrive at the place where we will be old, the place has already been decided by everything we did to get there. We discover, when we arrive, that we have built our own conclusion, even if we didn't realize at any point along the way that we were building. Ida built her conclusion. The suite was the conclusion she had built. Whether she would have built differently if she had known, in her 30s or her 40s, what the suite would look like, we cannot say. Perhaps yes, perhaps no. Perhaps she would have looked at the suite from a distance and recognized in it some shape that she even then preferred, some quietness that some part of her had always been moving toward. There is a thought that comes, sometimes, on quiet evenings, when one is contemplating long lives. The thought is that perhaps people end up more or less in the places they have always been moving toward. The endings are not surprises, they are arrivals. The arrival may be surprising in its particular details, but the general direction was set somewhere long ago by the deepest patterns of the person who was doing the moving. If this is true, then Ida's suite was not an aberration. It was a destination. The small Irish girl who'd been living all those years beneath the elegant surface of Mrs. Wood had always wanted, perhaps, a small quiet room of her own, a room where no one would be watching, a room where no performance was required. The mansion had been a kind of necessary detour. The dinner parties had been a kind of obligation. The whole grand and elegant life of Mrs. Wood had been a long and elaborate way of earning eventually the right to retreat. The retreat, when it came, was not the failure of the life, it was the reward. This is a generous reading, it may be too generous. But on a slow evening, in the soft hour before sleep, it is the reading that lets us look at Ida with kindness rather than with pity. And kindness is, in the end, the right register for stories like hers. This is the kind of question that does not have a tidy answer. It is the kind of question that, when we consider it carefully, in the gentle light of a quiet evening, opens out into other questions, and other questions still, and finally into a kind of soft contemplation that does not need to be resolved. Perhaps after all, Ida's life is not so different from many lives. Most of us are not poor Irish immigrants who reinvent ourselves as Southern belles, but most of us, in smaller ways, are constantly negotiating between who we were given to be and who we choose to be. We move away from our families. We change our names, sometimes for reasons of marriage or art or self-protection. We acquire accents that are not quite the accents we grew up with. We dress in clothes that present us as the kind of people we wish to be seen as. We perform, gently and incessantly, the long performance of being ourselves. Ida did this on a grander scale, with greater stakes, over a longer period of time, with more thoroughness than most. But the basic human work she was engaged in is the basic human work that all of us are engaged in. She was, perhaps, only an unusually committed practitioner of an art that all of us practice. There is one more thought, perhaps the gentlest of all, that belongs in this slow evening hour. The thought is about silence. Ida's life ended in silence. The rooms were silent for the last years, after Mary died and Emma died, and only Ida remained. The pages of the newspapers stacked along the walls were silent. The cracker tins under the bed were silent. The closed door was silent. The whole great noisy story of her life had subsided by the very end into the hush of a single old woman alone in a room. We tend to think of silence as an absence, as the lack of something. But silence is also in its way a presence. It is the presence of everything that has been. It is the gathered weight of all the noise that has happened, settled now into the quietness that comes after. The silence of Ida's last room contained, if you listened carefully, all the noises of her long life. The street vendors of Boston in the 1840s, the carriages of New York in the 1860s, the dinner conversations of the Wood Mansion in the 1870s, the hum of Broadway outside the hotel windows in the 1920s. All of it had ended up by the late 1930s in the silence of one old woman in a fifth-floor suite. The silence held it all. The silence was, in some sense, the form into which all the noise had finally been poured. This is what very old people sometimes carry, perhaps. They carry in their silence the accumulated sound of their long lives. They sit quietly in chairs by windows, and they appear to be doing nothing, but they are in fact holding more sound than any of us younger people have yet had the time to gather. They are vessels of memory, and the memory has its own weight, and the weight produces in time a stillness that looks like emptiness from outside, but is, on the inside, very full. This perhaps was Ida in her last years. Not empty. Full. Full of everything she had seen and done and become and unbecome. Full of the small Irish girl and the elegant Mrs. Wood and all the women in between. Full of the husband she had loved and the daughter she had raised and the sister she had kept beside her. Full of the cab ride home from the bank and the moment of placing the first bundle of bills in the bureau drawer and the long, quiet years afterward. Full of all of it. Sitting silently in a chair in a room in a hotel in a city in a country in a century that was not quite the century she had been born into. We are accustomed, in our own busy lives, to think of time as a forward arrow, with the past receding behind us and the future approaching ahead. But for very old people, time begins to behave differently. The past, instead of receding, comes closer. The events of 40 and 50 and 60 years ago feel, in some sense, more vivid than the events of yesterday. The names of childhood friends are easier to remember than the names of recent acquaintances. The smell of a kitchen one knew at age 6 can return, sudden and complete, while the menu of last week's dinner is a blank. Ida, in her last years, lived inside this kind of time. The past was perhaps more present to her than the present was. The small streets of Boston in the 1840s were perhaps more real to her than the suite at the Herald Square Hotel where her body actually was. The voices of her parents, her brothers, her sisters, the voices that had been silenced in her conscious life for most of her adulthood, were perhaps now allowed to return. In the silence of the suite, with no one watching, with nothing to perform for, she could perhaps finally let herself remember. She could let Ellen Walsh come back in some quiet form and sit with her in the chair and keep her company in the long stretches of the empty afternoons. This is perhaps a generous imagining. We do not know what she actually thought about, but it would be in keeping with what we do know, and it would explain something of the calm that observers noted in her final days. She was not afraid. She was not in any visible way regretful. She was simply, in the way that the very old can be, present with the long, full life that had brought her to this place. The life was nearly over. The life had been long. The life had contained, despite all the artifice and all the retreat, the basic substance that any life contains. Love, in some form. Loss, in some form. The slow accumulation of years with their small joys and their small sorrows, settling now into the silence that all years eventually become. This is a kind thing to think, on a quiet evening, in the slow ending of a long story. It is a thought that allows us to look at Ida not as a curiosity, not as a cautionary tale, not as an embarrassment or a tragedy, but as a person. Just a person. A person who lived her life as she could, with the material she had, in the world she found herself in, and who left when she went, the small, strange, marvellous wreckage that we have just spent these hours considering together. The kitchen in the early morning of 1907, where we began this long story, is empty now. The coffee that was on the stove has been poured into a cup, and the cup has been drunk and the cup has been washed and put away. The radio in the other room, which had been playing softly, has been turned off. The light in the kitchen, which had been the soft yellow of an electric bulb in a household that had only recently acquired electricity, has been switched off. The room is dark except for the faint blue-grey of an early morning sky beginning to show at the window. There is nothing here now. There is the sink with its enamel basin. There is the table with its checkered cloth. There is the stove, the small clock on the shelf, the rag rug by the door. There are the things of an ordinary American kitchen in an ordinary American year, and the ordinary American year is far, far behind us now. Ida's kitchen, if she had a kitchen at all in those last decades, was the corner of a hotel suite where a hot plate sat on a small table, and where she sometimes prepared, with the patience of an old woman who had nothing but time, the simple meals that kept her alive. The kitchen was not really a kitchen, it was a survival. But somewhere, in the larger story we have followed tonight, there were real kitchens. There was the kitchen of the small Walsh house in Boston, where a young Ellen helped her mother with the cooking, and where the smells of Irish bread and strong tea filled the small rooms in the morning. There was the kitchen of the second household in New York, where the staff Benjamin Wood employed prepared meals for Ida and her young daughter in the years before the marriage made the household official. There was the kitchen of the Wood mansion, in the years of the great dinners, where teams of cooks worked through long afternoons to prepare food for important guests. All those kitchens are gone now. The houses they belonged to have been demolished or repurposed, the way nearly all of 19th century New York has been demolished or repurposed. The streets where Ida walked have been torn up and repaved many times. The hotel where she lived for 22 years still stood for many decades, but has, like so many buildings, finally given way to the steady churn of the city. What remains is the story of a woman who became someone other than who she had been, the story of a long marriage and a great fortune and a closed door, the story of 3 women in 2 rooms and the slow turning of years that no one outside that door could have predicted or imagined. There is something else that remains, something quieter than the story. There remains, in some way that is hard to put into words, the simple fact of her having lived. She existed. She was here. For nearly a century she walked or sat or slept somewhere on the surface of this earth, and she had her thoughts, and she had her preferences, and she made her choices, and she felt, in whatever way each of us feels them, the small daily textures of being alive. The historical record preserves only a small fraction of any life, and Ida's life was preserved more than most because of the strangeness of its ending. But beneath the recorded strangeness was an ordinary continuous being, the being of a woman who happened to be Ida Mayfield Wood, or Ellen Walsh, or whatever name